Hello guys, welcome to Phoenix What If. So in this video, we will see, what if Godlike Naruto fell in love with Harribel in the world of Bleach? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. The Sun in the Endless Night. The heat was the first heresy. In the timeless, sterile chill of Hueco Mundo, where the only warmth came from the brief, violent bloom of acero or the friction of hierro on steel, this was a profound violation. It was a wet, living heat, a warmth that carried the ghost of a scent, ozone, blooming flowers, and something ancient, like sun-baked earth after a long rain. It clung to Mila Rose's skin, making the bone-white fragments of her hollow mask feel clammy against her face. She growled, a low, guttural sound of pure irritation, her heavy zanpakuto a familiar weight in her grip. "What is this?" she snarled, her voice a blade of impatience. "As Aizen testing some new weapon. If he's going to boil us alive, he could at least have the decency to announce it." Emilo Apache, ever the contrarian, scoffed. She paced restlessly on the pale dune, the three-pronged horn on her forehead catching the impossible light. "Don't be an idiot. Aizen's Ryutsu is cold, meticulous. This is something else. It's wild, uncontrolled." Her sharp, feral eyes scanned the horizon, which was no longer a familiar vista of white sand and black sky. The eternal night was gone, banished by a luminous, golden dome of light that stretched from one edge of the world to the other. At its apex, directly above them, hung a searing, perfect sphere of gold. Sun. The very concept was absurd. A child's forgotten fairy tale in a world defined by its absence. Cyan Sun, leaning gracefully against a twisted, petrified tree, was the calmest of the three. She watched her sisters bicker with an air of detached amusement, one long sleeve of her uniform hiding her mouth. "It feels full," she murmured, her voice a silken whisper that barely carried over the strange, new hum in the air. "The reishi. It's not thin and sharp anymore. It's dense, heavy." She took a slow, deliberate breath. "It's like breathing water." They fell silent, feeling it for themselves. She was right. The spiritual particles that made up their world, their food, their very existence, had changed. The oppressive emptiness that defined Hueco Mundo, the spiritual vacuum that drove every hollow to a state of perpetual, gnawing hunger, had been filled. The air itself felt nourishing, and for the first time in their memory, the deep, instinctual ache for souls was quiet. It was the most unnerving sensation any of them had ever experienced. A shadow fell over them, sharp and clean-edged in the brilliant light. Enough. Harribel landed on the sand with a soundlessness that belied her power. Her presence was an immediate anchor in the bewildering new reality. Her fracken snapped to attention, their bickering forgotten. The Tercera Espada's calm was a fortress. Her teal eyes, holding the cold depth of a glacial sea, were fixed on the golden orb in the sky. She wore her usual high-collared jacket, the bone fragments of her mask covering the lower half of her face, yet her expression was place. Aimed to read in the subtle tension of her shoulders and the focused intensity of her gaze. "Lady Harribel," Apache began, her tone shifting from abrasive to deferential. "We were just—" "I know what you were doing," Harribel cut her off, her voice low and resonant. She took a step forward, her hand resting on the hilt of the massive zanpakuto strapped to her back. "Report. When did this begin?" "An hour ago, maybe less," Mila Rose answered, glad for a concrete task. "It started as a flicker, a warmth on the horizon. We thought it was a mass Cero detonation. Then it just grew. And the sky turned from black to gold." Harribel's gaze swept across the transformed landscape. The white sand shimmered, and in the distance, the heat was so intense that the dunes seemed to warp and melt into glass. The petrified quartz trees, for so long mere skeletal monuments to a dead world, now cast long, dark shadows. It was a complete inversion of their reality. "Aizen-sama has not communicated with any of the Espada," Harribel stated. More to herself than to them. Her mind raced through the possibilities. A Shinigami invasion of unprecedented scale. Unlikely. Their methods were precise, focused on incursions, not terraforming. A rebellion from within Las Noches. Shiyelapura was capable of strange and terrible things, but his spiritual signature was one of cloying science, not this raw, elemental force. This felt primordial. It felt like the universe itself had decided to change its rules. The source is that way, she said, pointing toward the epicenter of the light, where the heat was most intense. The spiritual pressure is immense. But it's not oppressive. It's just there. A constant, steady presence, like a mountain or an ocean. She had never felt anything like it. Ryutsu in their world was a weapon. A declaration of dominance. It was meant to suffocate, to intimidate, to crush lesser beings into submission. This pressure was different. It didn't push down. It simply existed. And everything else was forced to exist around it. We will investigate, she declared. Her Kraken fell into formation behind her without a word. There was fear, yes, a deep, instinctual terror of he unknown, but their loyalty to Harribel was absolute. Where she went, they followed. They moved with the blinding speed of Sonido, their forms blurring into streaks of white against the golden sands. The journey was a descent into a furnace. The air grew thick and heavy, shimmering with heat. The hum intensified, vibrating in their bones, in the core of their spiritual beings. They passed other hollows, creatures great and small, scurrying away from the light in a blind panic. A pack of hulking Ajukas, normally apex predators who would have fought to the death over territory, scrambled past them without a second glance. Their only instinct to flee. The sheer scale of the power radiating from the epicenter was staggering. It was a constant, deafening roar of energy, yet it lacked any trace of malice. It was like standing next to a star. You would be incinerated by its sheer, indifferent power, but the star itself held no ill will. Finally, they crested a massive, crystalline dune, its surface fused into smooth obsidian glass by the heat. Below them lay a basin, a vast circular crater, and at its center was the source. It was a man. He sat cross-legged on the sand, his back perfectly straight, his hands resting on his knees. He wore simple black pants and a high-collared, form-fitting orange and black jacket that was unlike any uniform they had ever seen. His hair was a brilliant shade of sun yellow, spiky and untamed. His eyes were closed, and his face was serene, as if he were merely enjoying a pleasant afternoon nap. Above him, tethered by an invisible thread of power, blazed the miniature sun, the source of the impossible light and heat. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Around him, life was blooming. In a perfect circle extending 100 meters in every direction. The dead sand of Hueco Mundo had given way to lush, green grass. A small, clear stream of water bubbled up from the ground near his feet, carving a gentle path before being consumed by the hot sand beyond the circle. Small, nameless white flowers dotted the grass. It was a perfect, living oasis in the heart of a dead world. The four women stared, utterly speechless. This was not just power. This was creation. It was a feat that should have been the sole province of a god. Harribel's hand tightened on her sword. Her mind, usually so clear and tactical, was a maelstrom of confusion. Who was he? Where had he come from? What did he want? She felt the raw, untamed power of her Kraken behind her. Mila Rose's simmering rage, Apache's aggressive readiness, Sun Sun's coiled tension. She held up a hand. A silent command to wait. Rushing in against a being of this magnitude was suicide. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her boots crunching on the glassy sand. The man did not stir. As she drew closer, she could feel his Ryutsu more clearly. It was vast, deeper than any ocean, but it was also warm, and it held an undercurrent of something she had never encountered before, a profound, ancient loneliness. "You are trespassing in Hueco Mundo," she called out, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the ambient hum of his power. "This world is under the dominion of Lord Sosuke Aizen. State your name and your purpose." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the man's eyes opened. They were a startling, vibrant blue, as clear and deep as the sky of a world she had only seen in fleeting memories. There was no malice in them, no arrogance, only a calm, unwavering curiosity. He looked at her, then at her Kraken poised on the ridge behind her. A small, almost sad smile touched his lips. Aizen. Never heard of him. His voice was unexpectedly youthful, yet it carried a resonance that spoke of immense age and experience. "My name is Naruto Uzumaki. And I don't really have a purpose. I was just looking for a quiet place. The sheer absurdity of his statement stunned them into silence. A quiet place. He had torn a hole in the fabric of their reality, created a sun, and brought life to a world of death, and he claimed he was just looking for a quiet place. Mila Rose couldn't contain her outrage. A quiet place? You're burning our world to cinders. She roared, her lion-like hollow mask seeming to snarl with her. You think you can just show up and... Mila Rose. Harribel's voice was a whip crack of command. The Amazon Arankar fell silent. Thog. She continued to glare daggers at the seated man. Naruto's gaze shifted to Mila Rose, his blue eyes taking in her furious form. He didn't seem offended. He just seemed observant. Is that what I'm doing? I'm sorry. It's a bit of a subconscious habit. It gets so dark in here. He raised a hand, and the sun above him dimmed. Not by much, but enough to lessen the oppressive heat, to soften the blinding glare. The change was instantaneous, effortless. He had altered the fundamental state of their world with a casual gesture, like someone adjusting a lamp. The casual display of power was more terrifying than any threat. Who sent you? Harribel pressed, her mind racing. This being, this, Naruto, was either insane or so powerful that concepts like fealty and purpose were beneath him. She had to assume the latter. Are you with the Soul Society? No, he said simply, his gaze returning to her. He seemed to look right through her mask, past the warrior and the espada, and into the core of her being. It was an unnerving sensation. I'm not with anyone. I'm just me. He tilted his head slightly. You're different from the others I've sensed here. Their energy is all sharp edges and hunger. Yours is too, but beneath it, there's something else. Something fierce, like a shark defending its young. The observation was so specific, so accurate, that it caught Harribel completely off guard. Her entire existence, her entire philosophy, was built around the principle of sacrifice for the sake of her Fracken. She was the predator who protected her own. For this stranger to perceive that in a single glance was impossible. Apache's patience finally snapped. She couldn't stand the way he spoke to Lady Harribel, the calm, disarming way he dismantled their aggression without lifting a finger. Enough talk, she yelled, her body tensing. You will show respect to the Tercera Espada. Before Harribel could stop her, she launched herself forward, her sonido a blur of motion. She appeared directly in front of Naruto. Her hand outstretched, green spiritual energy coalescing into a Sero aimed point blank at his face. Naruto didn't move, he didn't flinch, he simply watched the incandescent green orb of destructive energy blossom before him. And then, just as it was about to incinerate him, he sighed. He lifted his right hand, his index and middle fingers extended. He gently tapped the Sero. It didn't explode, it didn't dissipate, it simply popped, like a soap bubble. The massive concentration of destructive energy vanished with a soft phut, leaving behind nothing but a faint wisp of green smoke. Apache froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. Every fiber of her being screamed at the impossibility of what had just happened. A Sero was pure, focused power. It could not be popped. That's not very nice, Naruto said, his voice still calm, but now carrying a hint of admonishment, like a parent scolding a reckless child. The moment of stunned silence was broken by a furious roar. How dare you? Mila Rose bellowed, her rage eclipsing her fear. She drew her broad, heavy zanpakuto, its sheer size intimidating. I'll tear you to pieces. She charged, her spiritual pressure flaring like a bonfire. Sun, seeing the situation escalate beyond control, moved as well, her long sleeves concealing the movements of her hands as she prepared her own attack. Stand down, Harribel commanded, but it was too late. Her Fracken were loyal, but they were also proud and fierce warriors. Such a blatant display of disrespect to their power was an insult they could not abide. Mila Rose swung her massive blade in a devastating arc meant to cleave Naruto in two. At the same time, Sun flicked her wrists, and 3 streams of serpentine energy shot from her sleeves, moving to encircle and constrict him. Naruto watched their approach with that same unnerving calm. As Mila Rose's blade descended, he didn't bother to dodge or block. He simply raised his left hand, palm open. The colossal Zanpakuto, a weapon capable of leveling a city block, stopped dead, its edge a mere inch from his palm, held fast by an invisible, unbreakable force. Mila rose strained, her muscles bulging. Her Ryutsu flaring to its absolute maximum, but the sword would not move. It was like trying to push over a mountain. Simultaneously, Sun Sun's energy snakes coiled around his arms and torso. But instead of constricting, they seemed to melt. The moment they touched his jacket, they dissolved into harmless particles of reishi, absorbed into his being without a trace. I told you, Naruto said, his voice losing its gentle edge, replaced by a profound weariness. I'm just trying to be quiet. His blue eyes glowed with a soft, golden light. A wave of energy, gentle as a summer breeze yet as unstoppable as a tsunami, rolled out from him. It wasn't an attack. It didn't burn or cut. It simply pushed. Mila rose, Apache, and Sun Sun were lifted off their feet and sent sailing backward through the air. They landed in a heap on the sand at the base of the crystalline dune, completely unharmed but utterly disoriented. Their spiritual pressure had been momentarily snuffed out, their connectee onto their own power severed as if a switch had been flipped. They lay there, gasping, not in pain, but in the shocking emptiness of being powerless. Only Harribel remained standing. The wave of energy had washed over her, but she had anchored herself with her own immense Ryutsu, the sand cratering around her feet as she resisted. It had taken a considerable effort, more than she would have needed to deflect a Gran Rey Sero. And he had done it without even standing up. She stared at him, her mind a blank slate of awe and terror. She had stood in the presence of Sosuke Aizen, a being whose power could warp the senses and rewrite reality. She had faced the raw, nihilistic emptiness of Ulquiorra Cipher and the bloodthirsty rage of Grimjow Jaegerjaquez. She had never, in all her long existence, felt power like this. It wasn't just greater in quantity, it was different in quality. Their power was about control, domination, destruction. His was about existence itself. He didn't need to dominate the world, he was a world. Naruto lowered his hand, the golden light in his eyes receding. He looked at the gasping forms of her Fracken, then back to her. There was no triumph in his expression, only a deep, abiding sadness. I don't want to fight you, he said, his voice quiet again. I've done enough fighting, more than enough for 1,000 lifetimes. He stood up, the movement fluid and graceful. He was taller than he looked sitting down, with a lean, powerful build. Your friends are fine. I just disconnected them from their energy for a moment. It'll come back. He took a step toward her, and every instinct in Harribel's body screamed at her to release her Zanpakuto, to unleash her Resurrección and drown him in an apocalyptic flood. It was her only chance. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that it would be useless. She could release an ocean, and he would simply turn it into steam. He stopped a few feet away, standing on the edge of his impossible green oasis. You're their leader, their queen, maybe. It wasn't a question. I can feel it. Your power is a shield for them. You carry their weight. He had no right to understand her so well. No right to see the truth she kept hidden behind a mask of cold indifference. What are you? She finally managed to ask, the words feeling small and inadequate. Naruto's gaze drifted up to the golden sun he had created. A relic, he said. A ghost of a smile on his face. A story that's been over for a very long time. I just haven't found the last page yet. He looked back at her, his blue eyes holding hers. Tell your master, Aizen, that this little corner of his kingdom is mine now. Not because I want to rule it, but because I want it to be left alone. Anyone is welcome, so long as they come in peace. Anyone who comes looking for a fight will be disappointed. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the simple, unshakable confidence of a fundamental law of nature. Harribel knew a tactical retreat when she saw one. There was no victory to be had here. There was only the collection of information and survival. She had gathered more than enough of the former to guarantee the latter. She gave a curt nod. I will deliver your message. Without another word, she turned her back on him, an act that took every ounce of her self-control, and walked toward her Fracken, who were slowly beginning to stir. Their spiritual pressure flickering back to life. She helped Mila rose to her feet, ignoring the woman's humiliated protests. Lady Harribel, we can still. Apache began, struggling to stand. No, Harribel said, her voice leaving no room for argument. We are leaving, now. She gathered her followers, and with a collective burst of sonido, they vanished, leaving the oasis of life and the man who was its source behind. As their spiritual signatures faded into the distance, a sound drifted across the newly illuminated desert. It was a scream, but it was unlike any scream Naruto had ever heard. It wasn't a cry of pain or terror. It was a sound of finality, of erasure. It was the sound of a soul being unmade. He turned his head, his advanced senses raying out across the vast expanse of the desert. He located the source miles away. An Ijuka's class hollow, a hulking beast of mindless instinct, had been cornered by something. But it wasn't another hollow. It was nothing. A patch of distorted air, a shimmering distortion in reality that was darker than the blackest night. The Ijukas lunged, its claws ready to tear and rend. But as it touched the distortion, it didn't bleed or break. It began to dissolve, not into the white spirit particles of a dying soul, but into black, crumbling motes of absolute nothing. Its very existence was being deleted from the universe. Its scream cut off abruptly as its head, and the consciousness within it, ceased to be. In seconds, the entire creature was gone, leaving not a trace behind. The patch of darkness wavered, then vanished. Naruto's brow furrowed. He had felt countless dark energies in his life. Hatred, malice, demonic chakra, the cold ambition of would-be gods. This was none of those. This was the antithesis of existence. It was the hungry silence of the void. He looked up at his sun, its golden light a defiant bastion of life and energy. Then he looked back in the direction Harribel and her followers had fled. He had come to this empty world seeking solitude, a final, quiet chapter to his long story. He had a sinking feeling he hadn't found it. He sighed, a long, weary sound that as carried away by the warm breeze rustling the grass at his feet. He sat back down, crossed his legs, and closed his eyes, returning to his meditation. But this time, his peace was gone, replaced by a renewed, and unwelcome sense of purpose. The sun above him seemed to shine just a little brighter, a little hotter, a silent declaration against the encroaching emptiness. In the endless night of Hueco Mundo, a new king had been crowned. Whether he wanted the throne or not. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. The Queen and the Anomaly. The throne room of Las Noches was a monument to emptiness. Its vast WHITE walls and impossibly high ceiling were designed to make even the most powerful being feel small, a single point of color in an overwhelming void of white. It was a space that reflected the soul of its master, sterile, grand, and utterly devoid of warmth. Cheer Harribel stood before the raised dais, her back straight, her expression hidden behind the bone-white mask. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and expectant. Sosuke Aizen sat on the throne, not with the rigid posture of a king, but with the relaxed air of a scholar in his study. One leg was crossed over the other, his chin resting thoughtfully on his knuckles. The Hogyoku, embedded in his chest, was a faint, pulsating presence, a quiet hum of transcendent power that was a mere whisper compared to the elemental roar she had witnessed in the desert. Beside him, Jin Ichimaru stood with his perpetual, unnerving fox-like grin, his eyes slitted shut. Kanami Tosen was a statue of stoic justice, his hand resting on the hilt of his zanpakuto. Blind eyes seeing more than most. So, Aizen began, his voice smooth and melodic, carrying effortlessly across the vast distance. A sun has risen in my kingdom. And you were the first to greet it, Harribel. Tell me what you saw. Harribel met his gaze without flinching. Lying to Aizen was impossible. His intellect and perception were as much a weapon as his Kyoka Suigetsu. Omission, however, was a necessary art of survival. I saw a man, she stated, her voice even and clear. An unknown entity of immense spiritual power. He calls himself Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto Uzumaki. Aizen repeated the name. Tasting it. A curious name. Does he belong to the Soul Society? Is he a wizard? A Quincy, perhaps? He claims no affiliation, Harribel replied. He stated he was simply looking for a quiet place. Jin let out a soft chuckle. A fella tears a hole in reality cause he's looking for a bit of peace and quiet. Sounds like my kinda guy. Aizen ignored him, his focus entirely on Harribel. His power. Describe it. Was it violent? Aggressive? This was the critical part. She chose her words with the precision of a surgeon. It is vast, overwhelming, but passive. It radiates from him like heat from a fire. He demonstrated the ability to create life, grass, water, from the reishi of the desert. He neutralized my Fracken's attacks without effort. She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. He did not seem hostile. Merely territorial. He has claimed the basin where he appeared as his own and warned against intrusion. Fascinating, Aizen mused, a genuine spark of academic curiosity in his brown eyes. This was not the reaction of a king whose sovereignty had been challenged. It was the reaction of a scientist who had just discovered a new, inexplicable law of physics. Creation. Not transmutation or illusion, but true creation. And this energy, it is not the ryutsu of a shinigami or a hollow. It is something else entirely. He looked at her, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. You seem unharmed, unsettled, but unharmed. Did you not engage him yourself, Tercera? The question was a subtle trap. To admit she hadn't would imply fear. To admit she hadn't failed would imply weakness. A direct confrontation would have been strategically unwise, she answered coolly. My purpose was reconnaissance, not pointless conflict. I gathered the necessary intelligence and withdrew. Of course, Aizen said, the smile never leaving his face. He knew she had stood before a power that dwarfed her own and had made the only logical choice. Her pragmatism was, after all, why he had made her an espada. This, Naruto Uzumaki, is a variable of the highest order. An anomaly that could disrupt the delicate balance of our plans. Or, he leaned forward slightly. His presence intensifying, he could be the key to accelerating them. He stood, descending the steps of the dais with a fluid grace. Your new mission is simple, Harribel. Observe him. Learn the nature of his power, his motivations, his weaknesses. Do not engage him directly unless absolutely necessary. I want to understand this piece before I decide where on the board it belongs. He stopped before her, his proximity a subtle form of intimidation. He is your responsibility now. Do not disappoint me. I understand, Aizen-sama, she said, dipping her head in a shallow bow. Good. You are dismissed. With a flicker of sonido, she was gone, leaving the three most powerful beings in Las Noches alone in the echoing silence. Well now, Jin said, stretching his arms languidly. A new pet for us to play with. This should be fun. Do not underestimate him, Jin, Aizen said, turning to gaze at the impossibly high ceiling as if he could see the golden sky beyond it. A being who can impose his own reality upon this world is not a pet. He is a rival god. And there is only room for one god in the heavens. The desert had a rhythm, a harsh and unforgiving heartbeat. Naruto walked across the endless white, feeling it in the soles of his feet. He had left his oasis behind, a beacon of life he could sense from anywhere in this dimension. The sun, his sun, had detached from its zenith and now followed him, a loyal, silent companion floating a few hundred feet above his head, casting a solitary circle of light and shadow in the vast emptiness. He was exploring, learning. This world was a study in extremes. The spiritual energy, the reishi, was thin and sharp, like breathing in microscopic blades of glass. It sustained the creatures here, but it offered no comfort, no nourishment for the soul. It only fed a perpetual, gnawing hunger that drove everything to mindless violence. He had seen it a dozen times in the last hour. A hulking, lizard-like hollow ambushing a smaller, insectoid one. Devouring it in a spray of white particles. A pack of wolf-like creatures fighting to the death over the desiccated husk of a long-dead beast. Survival of the fittest. It was a law he understood all too well. Konoha, his own village, had been forged in the crucible of the warring states period. He himself had been a pariah, forced to fight for every scrap of acknowledgement, every shred of respect. But there had always been something more. There had been Iruka's kindness. The camaraderie of Team 7. The will of fire. The belief that the village was a family, and that every life had value. Here, there was no such thing. There was only the hunger, the loneliness, and the fight. It was a world of a million isolated souls, all screaming their pain into a void that never screamed back. He sensed a spike of energy ahead, a flare of crude, brutish power mixed with the faint, terrified whimpers of something weaker. Curiosity guided him over the next dune. In the basin below, a scene of casual cruelty was unfolding. A large Arankar, broad and muscular with the remnants of a bull-like mask on his head, was toying with a small cluster of primitive hollows. They were little more than crawling masses of instinct, weak and barely sentient. The Urankar, who radiated the power of a Privar Espada, wasn't killing them. He was maiming them, swatting them with the flat of his enormous Zanpakuto. Laughing as they writhed and tried to flee, their pathetic screeches echoing off the dunes. "Dance for me, little worms." The brute bellowed, his laughter a harsh, grating sound. "Let me see you beg for the release of death." Naruto watched for a moment, his expression unreadable. He felt no anger, no righteous fury. Those emotions had been worn smooth by centuries of experience. What he felt was a profound sense of pity. Not just for the weak creatures being tormented, but for the tormentor himself. This Urankar's power was a hollow shell, his cruelty a desperate attempt to feel something. Anything, in this empty world. He was trying to prove his own existence by erasing others. Naruto didn't announce himself. He didn't flare his own energy. He simply took a step, and the world shifted. He was standing directly between the bully and his victims. The Urankar stumbled to a halt, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't sensed a thing. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, trying to cover his shock with aggression. "This is my territory. Get lost before I eat you." Naruto looked at him, his blue eyes calm and analytical. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice genuinely curious. "They are no threat to you. There is no honor in this. It serves no purpose." The Urankar stared at him as if he'd just started speaking in tongues. "Purpose, honor." He threw his head back and laughed. "The only purpose is to devour. To grow stronger. The weak exist to be fodder for the strong. That is the eternal law of Hueco Mundo. Now, for the last time, get out of my way." He charged, raising his massive sword for a downward cleave. His speed was impressive for his level, a blur of motion that would have overwhelmed most opponents. Naruto didn't move, he simply watched the blade descend. Just as the steel was about to make contact with his skull, he raised his right hand. Not to block, but to greet. He caught the colossal blade between his thumb and forefinger. The impact never came. The sword stopped dead, the force of the blow dissipating into nothing. The air vibrated with the sudden arrest of momentum. The Urankar's eyes bulged, his RMS straining against the impossible resistance. It was as if he had tried to cut the world in half and the world had simply refused. "Laws can be rewritten," Naruto said, his voice still level. He applied the slightest pressure, and a web of cracks spread across the Urankar's Zanpakuto. With a sharp ping, the blade shattered into 1,000 pieces, the metal dissolving into reishi before it even hit the ground. The Urankar stared at the empty hilt in his hands, then at Naruto, his bravado finally crumbling into pure, undiluted terror. What are you?" he stammered, scrambling backward. "Just a traveler," Naruto said, taking a step forward, "and I'm telling you to stop." He moved with a speed the Urankar couldn't even register. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next he was standing directly in front of him. His index finger gently tapping the center of the Urankar's chest. A jolt of warm, golden energy flooded the brute's system. It wasn't painful, it was overwhelming. Why spiritual pathway in his body was instantly and completely sealed. He collapsed to the ground, not unconscious, but utterly paralyzed, his limbs refusing to obey his commands. He was trapped inside his own body, powerless. Naruto turned his back on the fallen Urankar and knelt, looking at the small, whimpering hollows. He slowly extended a hand. His energy, which had been an unyielding wall moments before, now flowed from him as a gentle, soothing balm. The terrified creatures stopped their shaking. They seemed to hesitantly lean into the warmth, their primal instincts recognizing something that was not a threat, but a source of life and safety. It was at that moment that 4 new spiritual pressures appeared on the ridge of the dune above. Harribel and her Fracken stood there, silent, witnesses to the aftermath of the brief encounter. They had been tracking the brutish Urankar, who had been causing trouble near their territory, but had arrived too late, or perhaps, just in time. Rebel's eyes took in the scene. The shattered remains of a Zanpakuto, the paralyzed Urankar, and Naruto, kneeling in the sand, offering comfort to the lowest of creatures. It was a tableau that made no sense. She descended the dune, her Fracken following a few paces behind her. "You," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. Naruto looked up, his expression mild. Her again, he said to himself, then stood to face her. The Shark Queen. I was wondering when you'd show up. What you have done is pointless, she stated, her tone flat and devoid of emotion. She gestured to the small hollows, who were now huddled behind Naruto's legs like frightened children. You have saved them. For now. The moment you leave, the next predator will find them, and they will be devoured. Your mercy is a falsehood in this world. So you said before, Naruto replied, unfazed by her cold logic. You believe in the law of this world. The strong survive, the weak perish. It is not a belief. It is a fact, she countered, stopping a respectful distance away. To survive here is to accept that reality. To protect those I care for, I must be strong enough to make sacrifices. The weak are a liability. Protecting them is a sentiment we cannot afford. Her words were harsh, but Naruto heard the undercurrent beneath them. He heard the pain of a leader who had been forced to make impossible choices. The resolve of a woman who had decided that the only way to protect her family was to become the most dangerous predator in the ocean. I've heard that argument before, he said, his voice becoming soft, almost nostalgic. From people who thought power was a license to decide who lives and who dies. They were all wrong. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the immense power he kept so carefully contained. His blue eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. What is the point of a kingdom if it only protects the strong? What is the purpose of a king who would sacrifice the weakest of his people to save himself? That's not a kingdom. It's just a well-managed slaughterhouse. The words struck Harribel with the force of a physical blow. A slaughterhouse. Was that what her life's philosophy amounted to? You speak of ideals that cannot survive here. Mila Rose snarled from behind Harribel, unable to stay silent. This isn't some lush, green world where you can afford to be soft. This is Hueco Mundo. Naruto's gaze shifted to her, and his expression softened. Soft. Do you think it's soft to stand for something? Do you think it's easy? He looked from Mila Rose to Apache, then to Sun Sun. He addressed them not as subordinates, but as individuals. Your strength is impressive. You fight for your queen, for each other. You have a bond. That bond is the only law that truly matters. Why should it only apply to you? The three women were taken aback. No male, Arankar or otherwise, had ever spoken to them with such direct, unpatronizing respect. They were used to being seen as tools, as extensions of Harribel's will, or as objects of desire or contempt. He saw them as warriors, as people. Because, Harribel said, her voice a low growl, forcing his attention back to her. The moment you extend that bond to everyone, you create a weakness. A chain that your enemies will use to hang you. Only if you let them, Naruto countered. The other option is to become so strong that nobody can touch the people you protect. Not a single one. He took a step closer, his presence radiating an unshakable conviction. You talk about sacrifice. I'm telling you there's another way. A harder way. You don't sacrifice your comrades. You don't abandon the weak. You put your life on the line and you protect everyone. That's what it means to be a true leader. A true cage. Cage. The word was foreign, but its meaning was unmistakable in his tone. A leader who was a shield for all. Their philosophical debate was an impasse, a clash between the grim reality she had always known and the impossible ideal he embodied. She could not accept his worldview, but standing in the face of his absolute certainty, she could no longer be entirely sure of her own. Naruto broke the tense silence. He walked over to the paralyzed Arankar, who glared up at him with pure hatred and fear. I'll give you a choice, Naruto said to the downed bully. I can make this permanent. Or you can leave this place. Find a new territory, and never again prey on those who can't fight back. Your choice. The Arankar, given an option other than death, didn't hesitate. I'll go, he croaked, his voice filled with terror. Naruto snapped his fingers. The sealing energy vanished, and the Arankar scrambled to his feet. He gave Naruto and Harribel's group a wide, terrified berth and fled in to the desert with a speed born of pure panic. The act of mercy, of offering a choice to a worthless thug, was perhaps the most alien thing Harribel had seen him do. In her world, an enemy was either useful or dead. He will just do it again, somewhere else, she said, testing him. Maybe. Naruto admitted. But today, he was taught that the strong don't always win. And these little ones were taught that someone might come to their aid. Sometimes, a little bit of hope is all it takes to change the world. He looked at her, a small, genuine smile on his face. You should try it sometime. Harribel had no answer for that. She had come here to observe a threat, an anomaly. She had found something far more dangerous, a question. A question that threatened to unravel the very foundations of her existence. She gave a curt nod. We are leaving. She turned, her fracken falling in behind her. They were unusually quiet. Apache's usual aggressive posture was tempered with confusion. Mila Rose's fury was replaced by grudging respect for the power she had witnessed. Sun was watching Naruto with a thoughtful, analytical gaze, as if trying to solve an intricate puzzle. As they moved away, Harribel chanced to look over her shoulder. Naruto was still there, standing under his personal sun, a solitary beacon of impossible warmth in the cold, white desert. The small hollows were huddled at his feet, safe under his protection. He was an absurdity, a fool, a god, and for the first time since she had been made the Tercera Espada, Harribel felt a flicker of something she had long since buried. It felt terrifyingly like hope. Their return journey was silent until a chime sounded from a small device on Harribel's belt. She stopped, her body going rigid. It was a priority communicatee. On link she only gave to her most trusted scouting parties. She activated it. Report, she commanded. Static answered her. Then a single, panicked voice, cut through with the sound of wind and something else, a strange, sucking silence. 80 Harribel. Squad is gone. They just vanished. There's nothing here. It's empty. The transmission ended in an abrupt, sharp silence. Not the silence of a broken link, but the silence of a speaker who had simply ceased to exist. Harribel stood frozen, the dead communicator in her hand. Her scouting party, gone. Not defeated, not killed, vanished. The last word echoed in her mind. Empty. She looked across the vast desert, back toward the impossible oasis and its impossible master. The anomaly in her world was not the only thing she had to worry about. Something truly ancient and terrible was stirring in the thirsty sands of Hueco Mundo. And her people were in its path. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. An invitation from a false god. The silence that followed the transmission was more profound than the eternal quiet of the desert. It was a void, an absence where a life had just been. Harribel stood frozen, the small communicator clutched in her fist, the metallic edges digging into her palm. Her scouting party, 5 Arankar, loyal and seasoned, handpicked for their skill and discretion. Not just soldiers, her people, vanished. The final, choked, word of the report echoed in her mind, empty. Mila Rose was the first to react, her grief manifesting as a familiar, explosive rage. What happened? Who was that? Aizen's dogs. Shinigami. She drew her massive Zanpakuto, its weight a comforting anchor in the sudden storm of uncertainty. Give the order, Lady Harribel. We'll hunt them down and make them pay. There is no one to hunt, Harribel said, her voice dangerously quiet. She forced her fist to unclench, her tactical mind fighting to suppress the cold wave of fury and fear that threatened to consume her. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. The transmission was cut, the Ryutsu signature of the entire squad, it's gone. Not faded, not masked. Gone. Apache paced like a caged animal, her cerulean eyes darting across the horizon as if expecting an ambush. That's not possible. Even if they were all killed at once, there would be residual energy. A trace. Something. It's like that scream we heard, Sun murmured, her usual detached calm fractured by a visible shudder. The Ajukas that dissolved into nothing. This feels the same. Cold. Final. Harribel's gaze drifted back towards the golden light of Naruto's oasis. Shish. He had just left a confrontation with one impossible entity, only to be faced with another, far more insidious one. The man-god was a known quantity, his power was immense, but it was overt. You could see it, feel it. This new threat was a cancer in the fabric of their world, a silent predator that left no tracks. The coordinates, she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. Sun, G.I. Vey me the last known location of the scouting party. Sun, ever the efficient one, produced a small, intricate device and tapped its surface. A map of shimmering reishi lines appeared in the air. They were investigating an unusual drop in spiritual particle density here, she said, pointing to a location deep in the southern quadrant, a notoriously barren and featureless expanse of desert known as the Sea of Bones. Approximately 30 leagues from our current position. We're going, Harribel declared. Alone? Apache questioned, her protective instincts flaring. Lady Harribel, we don't know what we're facing. Which is precisely why we are not taking an army, Harribel countered, her logic sharp and cold as ice. Until I understand the nature of this threat, I will not risk more of my people. We will investigate, we will learn, and then we will act. Move. Their sonito tore through the desert, 4 streaks of white against the shimmering sands. They moved with a desperate urgency. The golden light of Naruto's sun shrinking behind them. The world returned to its familiar, oppressive moonlight, the air growing thin and sharp again, the old hunger beginning to gnaw at the edges of their consciousness. It was a strange, unwelcome return to normalcy. The Sea of Bones was aptly named. The dunes here were littered with the colossal skeletons of ancient, long-dead hollows, air-bleached white ribs curving towards the black sky like the ruins of some forgotten cathedral. The air was unnaturally still, the silence so complete it felt like a pressure against the ears. They arrived at the coordinates and found nothing. There were no signs of a struggle. No craters from a Sero blast, no scorched sand, no scattered blood or body parts. The 5 distinct Ryutsu signature S of her patrol had simply vanished from this exact spot. It was as if they had been standing here one moment, and the next, the universe had decided they had never existed at all. Anything? Harribel asked, her senses stretched to their absolute limit, probing the environment for the faintest clue. Mila Rose kicked at the sand in frustration. Nothing. It's just sand. There's not even a footprint. The reishi, Sun whispered, kneeling and letting the white grains run through her fingers. It's wrong. It's thin, starved, but more than that, it's static. Lifeless. Like it's been scrubbed clean. Harribel felt it too. It was the spiritual equivalent of a vacuum-sealed room. The natural, subtle flow of energy that permeated all of Hueco Mundo was absent here. It was a dead zone. Ch of absolute null space where the rules of existence seemed to have been temporarily suspended. The scream of the dissolving Ajukas, the final word of her scout, empty. This was the emptiness they spoke of. Her strategic mind, which could process battlefields and devise complex tactics in a heartbeat, had no framework for this. How do you fight an enemy that is the absence of everything? How do you attack nothingness? As she stood there, wrestling with a problem that had no logical solution, the world warped. The air grew heavy, the spiritual pressure dropping like a stone. 3 figures materialized from the shadows of a colossal skeleton, their appearance as silent and sudden as a thought. Aizen, Jin, Tosen. Harribel's hand flew to her Zanpakuto, her frakken instantly forming a defensive perimeter around her. Her heart hammered in her chest, not with fear, but with a surge of adrenaline. Aizen rarely left the confines of Las Noches. For him to appear here, in person, meant that his situation had escalated to a level she couldn't yet comprehend. My, what a somber gathering, Jin Ichimaru drawled, his smile stretching impossibly wide in the pale moonlight. Did we interrupt a funeral? Aizen-sama, Harribel said, her voice a tight coil of control. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect that felt like a concession. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Intrusion. Aizen's tone was one of gentle chiding. I am the king of this world, Harribel. There is no place my presence can be considered an intrusion. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the empty space. His perception was on another level entirely. He wasn't just looking at the sand, he was reading the very code of reality beneath it. 5 of your subordinates vanished without a trace, a curious and troubling development. Quote, he knew. Of course, he knew. He likely knew the moment it happened. I was handling it, she stated, her jaw tight. I have no doubt, Aizen said smoothly. But this event, coupled with your illuminating report on our new visitor, suggests these matters might be connected. A new power appears, and my soldiers begin to disappear. I am a great believer in causation, Harribel. I felt it was time I met this, Naruto Uzumaki, myself. He gave her a placid, unreadable smile. And I thought you should accompany me. As you have already made his acquaintance. It was not a request. It was a command, wrapped in the guise of a courtesy. She was being summoned, her authority over her own investigation summarily dismissed. She was a piece on his board, being moved into position. The rage simmered beneath her calm exterior, a volcano capped with ice. But she was a pragmatist. Defying Aizen here and now was suicide. As you wish, Aizen-sama, she said, the words tasting like ash. Excellent, Aizen said, turning as if the matter was already settled. Let us go and extend a proper welcome to our new neighbor. He didn't use sonido. He simply tore a garganta open in the fabric of space. A swirling vortex of black energy. It was a show of power, a casual display of his mastery over this world. He, Jin, and Tosen stepped through without a backward glance, leaving the portal open for her. Harribel exchanged a look with her Fracken. Their expressions were a mixture of fury and apprehension. They were being forced into another confrontation with a being who had effortlessly humiliated them. This time in the company of the master they served but did not trust. Stay on your guard, she ordered in a low voice. And say nothing unless I command it. She led them into the garganta, the darkness swallowing them whole. They emerged moments later not in the desert, but on the crystalline ridge overlooking Naruto's oasis. The sight was even more jarring the second time. Below them, the circle of vibrant green grass seemed to glow under the light of the golden sun that hung in the sky. The small stream gurgled, its sound an alien melody in the silent world. And in the center of it all, Naruto sat, not meditating, but tending to the small, weak hollows he had rescued. He was showing one of them how to cup water from the stream, his movements patient and gentle. The contrast between the two factions gathered on the ridge was stark. On one side stood Aizen, Jin, and Tosen. Their energy was sharp, cold, and intricate, a web of calculated power and ambition. On the other stood Harribel and her Fracken. Their energy was wilder, more primal, a fierce, predatory fire banked by loyalty. And below them was Naruto. His energy was a vast, placid ocean of life, warm and seemingly infinite. It didn't react to their arrival. It didn't flare in warning or shrink in fear. It simply was. Naruto looked up, his blue eyes sweeping over the assembled group. He showed no surprise, no alarm. He simply acknowledged their presence with a calm, steady gaze. He stood up slowly, the small hollows scattering to hide in the tall grass. More visitors, he said, his voice carrying easily up to the ridge. You brought your boss this time, Shark Queen. Aizen smiled, a picture of polite intellectualism. Naruto Uzumaki, I presume. I am Sosuke Aizen. It is a ple. Assert to finally meet the architect of this miraculous anomaly. He descended the glassy dune, his movements elegant and unhurried. Jin and Tosen followed, flanking him like specters. I'm not an architect, Naruto replied simply. Watching them approach, I just like a little more light. A humble sentiment for one who can command a star, Aizen mused, stopping at the edge of the grass. The line between the dead sand and the living oasis was a clear, sharp border, a demarcation between two opposing realities. I confess, you have me at a disadvantage. I have made it my life's work to study and understand the evolution of souls. Shinigami, Hollow, Quincy, I believed I understood the full spectrum of spiritual existence. You, however, are something entirely new. Tell me, what is your purpose in my world? Naruto met his gaze, and for a moment, two beings of transcendent power sized each other up. Aizen's eyes held the cold, calculating brilliance of a master strategist. Naruto's held the deep, quiet wisdom of a man who had seen the rise and fall of ages. I already told her, Naruto said, nodding toward Harribel. I don't have a purpose. And I don't think this is your world any more than it's mine. A world belongs to the people who live in it. The simple, populist statement was a direct refutation of Aizen's entire philosophy. Jin's smile widened a fraction. This was getting interesting, and admirable, if naive. Philosophy, Aizen said, his tone unwavering. But a world without leadership, without a guiding will, descends into chaos. It is the natural order. The lion commands the pride. The king commands the nation. A god must command reality. That is the throne of heaven I intend to claim. A being of your power could be invaluable in forging this new world. Join me. I can offer you a purpose far greater than quiet solitude. I can offer you an existence without limits. It was a tempting offer. Power, purpose, godhood. He was offering Naruto everything he himself craved. Naruto actually laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a soft, genuine chuckle of amusement. An existence without limits. I've had that. It's boring. He shook his head. Thanks for the offer, but I'm not interested in being anyone's subordinate. Especially not someone who reeks of lies and craves power he doesn't understand. The air temperature dropped by several degrees. Aizen's smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. For the first time, a flicker of genuine annoyance appeared in his spiritual pressure, a sharp, cold spike in the calm. A shame, Aizen said, his voice losing its melodic quality. Taking on a harder edge. I had hoped you would be reasonable. Power that is not guided by ambition is wasted potential. He decided to change tactics, moving from intellectual seduction to a more direct form of manipulation. Perhaps a gift might change your mind. A gesture of goodwill to foster our new friendship. He raised a hand, and Jin stepped forward. We happened to run into one of your new friend's subordinates on our way here, Jin said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. She was scouting a little too close to Las Noches. We thought it'd be safer to hold on to her for a while. A palpable wave of fury erupted from Harribel. Her spiritual pressure flared, a golden corona of power exploding around her. What did you do? She snarled, her hand grippy. In her zanpakuto so tightly her knuckles were white. Mila Rose and Apache moved forward, their own weapons drawn, their faces masks of feral rage. Aizen ignored them completely, his eyes fixed on Naruto. I can have her return to you. Of course, unharmed. A simple token to show the benefits of cooperation. It was a classic power play. He had taken a hostage, one of Harribel's precious Frakken, and was now offering her back to Naruto, attempting to frame himself as the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of their relationship. He was trying to establish a hierarchy, with himself at the top. Naruto's calm expression didn't change, but his blue eyes went cold. He looked past Aizen, his gaze meeting Harribel's for a fraction of a second. He saw the barely contained panic and rage in her eyes. He saw the fierce, protective love she had for her people. And he remembered his promise. You protect everyone. Which one? Naruto asked, his voice flat. The quiet one with the snakes, Jin supplied cheerfully. Son. Harribel's control finally snapped. She took a step forward, ready to launch an attack, suicide or not. But Naruto held up a hand, a silent command for her to stop. She froze, caught between her rage at Aizen and the undeniable authority radiating from the blonde man. Naruto turned his full attention back to Aizen. You think that makes you powerful? Taking people who are weaker than you, hiding them in your fortress. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. You don't get it at all. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, he let a fraction of his true power loose. The golden sun above them blazed with renewed intensity. The ground trembled. The very air grew thick, not with pressure, but with pure, unadulterated life energy. 9 distinct, colossal animalistic auras, a fox, a cat, a turtle, a monkey, and more, roared into existence around him, invisible but overwhelmingly present. They were the Biju, their chakra now a permanent part of his being. Aizen's eyes widened slightly. Jin's smile finally faltered. Tosen took a half step back, his hand tightening on his sword. This was power beyond their comprehension. It felt ancient, sacred, and absolutely absolute. Your fortress is made of reishi, Naruto stated, his voice now resonating with the power of a deity. This entire world is made of reishi. And all of it, every single particle, answers to me. He didn't move. He didn't use a technique. He simply reached out. Not with his hands, but with his will. His consciousness expanded, leaving his body behind. In less than an instant, it crossed the vast expanse of the desert. It passed through the impenetrable walls of Las Noches as if they were smoke. It bypassed every Keto barrier, every alarm, every guard. His senses mapped the entire fortress in a nanosecond, the throne room, the Espada quarters, the laboratories of Shielapuro. He found her in a secure holding cell in the deepest level of the fortress. guarded by two Privan Espada. He felt her fear, her defiant spirit. And then he pulled. Back at the oasis, a shimmering distortion appeared in the air beside Naruto. It solidified, and Cyan Sun stumbled out, collapsing to her knees on the soft grass. She was unharmed, her uniform slightly disheveled, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. One moment she had been in a cold, white cell, and the next, she was here. She looked up and saw Naruto standing before her, his power a comforting, warm blanket. Then she saw Harribel, Mila Rose, and Apache, their faces a mixture of stunned relief and absolute awe. The silence on the ridge was deafening. Aizen, the master of manipulation, the man who was always 10 steps ahead, was utterly speechless. His ultimate defense, his impenetrable fortress, his hostage, all of it had been rendered completely and totally irrelevant in less than a second. Naruto hadn't just broken the rules of the game, he had demonstrated that he was place. Eyeing an entirely different game altogether, one Aizen didn't even know existed. Jin was the first to recover, letting out a low whistle. Well, that's a new one. Naruto's power receded, the overwhelming presence of the Biju fading back into him. The world settled, the trembling ground growing still. He looked at Aizen, his expression not of triumph, but of finality. Don't ever, he said, his voice now a deadly whisper. Threaten people I'm protecting. This is your only warning. Aizen stared at him, his mind racing, trying to process the scale of his miscalculation. He had come here to assess a new piece on the board. He had found a player who could flip the board over at any time he wished. He had tried to be the god, but he had just met the universe. He composed himself with a supreme act of will, his placid mask settling back into place. It seems I have underestimated you, Naruto Uzumaki, he said, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil. This has been a most educational encounter. He turned to leave, his gambit a catastrophic failure. One more thing, Naruto called out. Aizen paused, his back still to him. There's something else out there. Something that erases your soldiers. It's not me, but it's a problem. For all of us. Aizen stood silent for a moment, then continued walking toward the garganta he had left open. The affairs of Hollows are my concern, not yours, he said dismissively. And stepped through the portal. Jin gave a little wave, and Tosen simply vanished. The garganta sealed behind them, leaving only the 5 women and the man in the oasis. An awkward silence fell. Sun got to her feet and rushed to Harribel's side, the 3 Fracken fussing over her, their relief palpable. Harribel watched them for a moment, her heart, which she so often kept locked in ice, filled with a fierce, burning warmth. He had saved one of them. He had done what he said he would do. He had protected one of her family without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. She turned to face him. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. She walked down the dune and stopped before him on the grass. The power disparity between them was a chasm, but for the first time. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a shield. Aizen is now your enemy, she stated, her voice formal. He will not forgive the humiliation you dealt him today. He will plot. He will use every resource at his disposal to understand and then destroy you. Let him try, Naruto said with a shrug. You will need allies, she continued, her gaze unwavering. You cannot stand against all of Las Noches and the Soul Society, should they ever turn their eyes here, alone. I'm stronger than I look, he said with a small smile. I know, she said, and the admission was a profound one. But there is another enemy. The one you spoke of. The emptiness that took my patrol. She took a deep breath, making a decision that would change the course of her life, and the course of this world. My Fracken and I will not be Aizen's pawns. And we cannot fight this new threat alone. I propose an alliance. She stood tall, meeting his gaze as an equal, despite the gulf in their power. Not as a subordinate, but as a partner. My forces, my knowledge of this world, united with your power. We will face Aizen together, and we will face this darkness together. Naruto looked at her, then at the 3 women standing behind her, a united, fiercely loyal front. He saw not a defeated rival, but a proud queen offering her fealty not out of weakness, but out of a strategic understanding of the new reality. She was doing what she had to do to protect her people. Her philosophy hadn't changed, but her methods were adapting. He thought of the encroaching void, the silent, hungry emptiness that was beginning to poison the edges of this world. He had come here for peace, but it seemed the universe had other plans. And maybe, after so long alone, fighting alongside someone else wouldn't be so bad. "All right, Shark Queen," he said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "You've got a deal, but on one condition." "Name it," she said without hesitation. "We do it my way," he said, his blue eyes twinkling with a light she was beginning to find less alien and more compelling. "No sacrifices. We protect everyone." For the second time that day, Harribel was rendered speechless. But this time, it was not from shock or fear. She looked at the man who had humbled a false god and created life from dust, who spoke of impossible ideals as if they were simple truths. And against all logic, against every harsh lesson her world had ever taught her, she found herself believing him. She gave a single, sharp nod. Agreed. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. The Sound of a Beating Heart. The oasis was a paradox, an open wound of life in the sterile body of Hueco Mundo. In the days following the alliance, it had become the heart of a fledgling, impossible kingdom. Under Naruto's passive influence, the circle of green had expanded, the grass creeping outward over the white sand like a slow, verdant tide. The single stream had branched into a network of clear, babbling brooks. New flowers bloomed, vibrant splashes of color, blues, reds, and purples, that had no right to exist in this monochromatic world. His sun, a constant golden companion in the sky, pulsed with a gentle, life-giving energy that saturated the very air. For the Rancor who had begun to gather, drawn by the undeniable beacon of power and safety, it was a place of profound confusion. They were creatures of instinct, honed by an eternity of hunger and conflict. They knew how to fight, how to kill, how to dominate. They did not know what to do with peace. They sat in awkward, silent groups on the lush grass, watching the water flow, their predatory instincts soothed by the nourishing reishi, yet their minds restless and uncertain. Harribel stood on a small rise overlooking the nascent settlement, her arms crossed. A silent sentinel, her Fracken were nearby, their own discomfort a mirror of the others. Mila Rose was sparring restlessly with a hulking Rancor who had sworn fealty, her movements sharp and aggressive, as if trying to beat the unfamiliar tranquility into submission. Apache was patrolling the perimeter, her eyes scanning the dunes for threats that weren't there, her body coiled with a tension that had no outlet. Only Sun was still, sitting by one of the new streams, watching the way the light played on the water with a thoughtful, analytical expression, trying to deconstruct the miracle with logic. This was her army now, a collection of hardened survivors, killers, and lost souls, all held together by the gravity of the man who was currently sitting in the middle of it all, teaching a group of child-sized hollows how to weave blades of grass together. She watched him, a constant source of fascination and frustration. He moved with an unnerving lack of artifice. He held no court, issued no grand proclamations. His authority was not derived from fear or command, but from an overwhelming presence that simply inspired compliance. The Rancor didn't obey him because they feared his wrath. They did so because in his presence, violence felt pointless, immature. It was the most effective and infuriating form of control she had ever witnessed. Their alliance was a practical necessity, a strategic masterstroke in the face of two overwhelming threats. But the reality of it was a constant challenge to her own identity. She was a queen forged in the crucible of sacrifice. Her strength came from her willingness to make the hard choices, to cut away the weak to preserve the strong. His philosophy, the one he had bound her to, "We protect everyone," was a beautiful, impossible poison. It felt like a betrayal of every lesson she had ever learned. "You're thinking too loud." She didn't startle. She had felt him approach, his spiritual signature as Fami. Liar now as the feel of her own Zanpakuto. Naruto came to stand beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze following hers over the strange new community. "I am observing the fragility of our position," she corrected, her tone clipped and formal. "Our forces are a mix of my loyal soldiers and desperate refugees. They are not unified. They are not ready for a war with Aizen, let alone a battle against an enemy we cannot comprehend." "No," he agreed easily. "They're not. But they're not hungry. They're not afraid." For the first time, probably ever, they have a full belly and a safe place to sleep. That's a start. He picked a blade of grass, chewing on the end of it thoughtfully. You can't build an army out of fear and expect it to stand against true despair. You build it out of hope. Give them something worth fighting for, and they'll fight harder than you can imagine. Hope is a luxury, she countered, the words an old, familiar shield. It is the first thing to be discarded in a real battle. Only if you think of it as a supply, he said, turning to look at her. His blue eyes were clear, holding none of the calculating depth of Aizen's or the cold emptiness she'd seen in other Espada. They were just open. Hope isn't a supply, it's a weapon. It's the only weapon that gets stronger the more you use it. Before she could formulate a response to his infuriatingly simple logic, the world grew cold. It was not a gradual change. It was a sudden, violent plunge in temperature, as if the sun had been instantly extinguished. The vibrant colors of the oasis seemed to mute, the lush greens and bright flowers turning a dull, washed-out gray. The gentle hum of life energy that permeated the air was silenced, replaced by a profound and absolute emptiness. It was a silence that did not just lack sound, but actively consumed it. The babbling brooks fell quiet. The sparring Arankar froze mid-strike. Every soul in the oasis felt it, a chilling, spiritual vacuum that promised nothing but oblivion. Harribel's hand was on her sword in an instant, her ryutsu flaring to life, a golden mantle of defiance against the encroaching chill. Her Frakken were at her side in a flash, their own weapons drawn, forming a protective wall around her. A single figure stood at the edge of the oasis, on the border between the grass and the sand. He hadn't arrived with a flash of sonito or a tear in space. He had simply appeared, as if he were a natural consequence of the sudden void. He was slender, dressed in the white uniform of an Espada, with a bone-white mask fragment forming a horned helmet on the left side of his head. His skin was unnaturally pale, his hair a raven black, but it was his eyes that held the true terror. They were a piercing emerald green, and they held nothing. No anger, no hatred, no curiosity, just a vast, deep, and terrifying emptiness. His presence was a blight upon the very concept of existence. Ulquiorra cipher, Harribel breathed, her voice a low growl. The Quattro Espada, the one who embodied the very concept of nihilism. His aspect of death was despair. Naruto stood beside her, his expression unchanged, but the air around him had grown taut. His personal sun still hung in the sky, but its golden light seemed to struggle against the oppressive aura of the newcomer, its rays bending and warping as if passing through a distorted lens. Lord Aizen wishes for a more thorough understanding of the anomaly, Ulquiorra stated, his voice a monotone, devoid of any inflection. He looked at Naruto, his green eyes analytical and dismissive. Your existence is illogical. Your energy signature violates several fundamental principles of spiritual mechanics. You are a disruption to the natural order. The natural order around here aims to be a lot of killing and not much else, Naruto replied, his tone conversational, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension. I figured I'd try something different. Different is not always better. Often, it is simply wrong. Ulquiorra said. He took a single, slow step onto the grass. Where his foot fell, the vibrant green blades instantly withered, turning black and crumbling into dust. The life was not just killed. It was unmade. Your presence here is an act of rebellion. Lord Aizen has tasked me with gauging the precise nature of your threat. So you're here to fight, Mila Rose snarled, stepping forward. Good. I was getting bored. I am not here to fight, Ulquiorra corrected, his gaze not even gracing her with a glance. Fighting implies a potential for victory on both sides. This is an analysis, an execution, if necessary. His casual, absolute dismissal of their power was a greater insult than any taunt. The combined spiritual pressure of Harribel and her Frakken was immense, enough to make the very foundations of Las Noches tremble. To Ulquiorra, it was nothing more than ambient noise. Stay back, Naruto said, his voice quiet but firm. He took a step forward, placing himself between Ulquiorra and everyone else. This one's different. His energy, it's not meant to attack. It's meant to erase. Harribel watched, her tactical mind racing. A direct assault was madness. Ulquiorra was a monster of a different breed than the other Espada. His power was subtle, absolute, and his hierro was rumored to be the strongest of them all. But to stand and do nothing while this newcomer, this ally, faced him alone, it went against every instinct she had. What is it you hope to accomplish here? Naruto asked Ulquiorra, his stance relaxed, betraying no hint of aggression. You want to understand me? Go ahead, look, ask whatever you want. Ulquiorra tilted his head, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity in his empty eyes. You do not fear me. It was not a question. It was an observation of an anomaly. I've faced down fear itself, Naruto said with a small, sad smile. You're just a guy who's really, really lonely. The statement hung in the cold air, so unexpected and so incisive that it seemed to momentarily disrupt even Ulquiorra's perfect composure. A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed his face before being subsumed by the void once more. Loneliness is a human emotion, a construct of the heart, Ulquiorra said, his voice regaining its monotone. I have no heart. Such things are meaningless. He raised a hand, his index finger pointed at Naruto. A small, dense sphere of black and green energy began to coalesce at its tip. A Sero, not the wide, explosive blast of a lesser Arankar, but a Sero Ascuras, the Black Sero, a technique of devastating, soul-crushing power. Meaning is found in the disparity of power. Allow me to demonstrate. He fired. The beam of black energy tore through the air, not with a roar, but with a horrifying, high-pitched scream, the sound of reality being ripped apart. It moved with incredible speed, its path leaving a trail of withered, dead air in its wake. Harribel braced hers, elf for an impact that would obliterate the entire oasis and everything in it. She prepared to release her Zanpakuto, to try and counter the blast with her own power, a futile but necessary gesture. But Naruto didn't move to counter it. He didn't raise a shield or prepare an opposing blast. He simply lifted his right hand, palm open, as if to catch it. And he did. The Sero Ascuras, an attack that could vaporize a fortress, slammed into his open palm and stopped. It didn't explode. It churned and writhed, a caged singularity of destruction, its immense power held in check by the effortless strength of the man holding it. The ground around Naruto cracked and split, the grass for 100 feet behind him was torn from the earth, but he himself did not move a single inch. With a soft sigh, he closed his fist. The Sero Ascuras was crushed, snuffed out of existence as if it were a candle flame. The world fell silent again. Every Arankar watching, from Harribel down to the weakest refugee, stared in utter, slack-jawed disbelief. The casual, almost lazy way he had neutralized an attack of that magnitude was more terrifying than any display of rage. Ulquiorra's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. I see, he said, his voice still flat. Your physical durability and energy negation are considerable. But that is merely the shell. Aizen-sama is more interested in the ghost within. He vanished. His sonito was so fast it was less a movement and more a cessation of presence in one location and a beginning in another. He appeared directly in front of Naruto, his hand shaped into a blade, aimed at Naruto's chest. Naruto's reaction was just as fast. He didn't block the blow. He simply took a half step to the side, the lethal hand strike passing harmlessly through the space where his heart had been. As Ulquiorra's momentum carried him past, Naruto reached out and placed his hand gently on the Espada's shoulder. The moment he made contact, Ulquiorra froze. It wasn't a physical restraint. It was something far deeper. Naruto wasn't just touching his body, he was touching his soul. He closed his eyes, and his own energy, the warm, golden life force of his chakra mixed with the boundless power of the Sage of Six Paths, flowed into Ulquiorra. It wasn't an attack, it was a communication. Naruto wasn't trying to harm him. He was trying to show him. You say you have no heart, Naruto said, his voice a low murmur that only Ulquiorra could hear. You think it's a weakness, an illusion, but you're wrong. Let me show you what it really is. For Ulquiorra Cipher, whose entire existence was a void of sensation, it was an overwhelming, incomprehensible flood. He suddenly felt the fierce, desperate loyalty of Apache, Mila Rose, and Sun for their queen, a bond forged in battle and shared suffering. A cord of spiritual energy that was as real and tangible as any Zanpakuto. He felt the collective, trembling hope of the dozens of weak Arankar huddled in the oasis, a fragile persistent light in the darkness of their lives. He felt the ancient, unyielding love of the planet itself, a deep, resonant hum of life that he had never been able to perceive before. And then, Naruto showed him his own memories. Not the grand battles or the displays of power. He showed him the small things. The taste of Ichiraku ramen after a hard day of training. The feeling of the sun on his face as he sat atop the Hokage monument. The shared laughter with his friends. The quiet, profound sadness of his teacher's death. The fierce, burning determination to bring a friend back from the darkness. He showed him joy, grief, rage, love, the entire chaotic, beautiful, painful spectrum of a life lived to its absolute fullest. He was forcing Ulquiorra to experience the very thing he denied. The heart. Ulquiorra staggered back, ripping himself away from Naruto's touch as if he had been burned. He clutched his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his emerald eyes wide with something that looked terrifyingly like confusion. For the first time in his existence, the perfect, placid void of his being had been violated. He had felt something. And it was agonizing. What was that? He demanded, his voice for the first time holding a raw, sharp edge of emotion. What did you do to me? I let you borrow my heart for a second, Naruto said softly, his own eyes filled with a deep, profound empathy. I feel it, you know. The emptiness inside you. It's not a philosophy. It's a wound. You weren't born like this. Something broke you. Something hollowed you out until there was nothing left. Ulquiorra stared at him, his mind reeling. The things he had seen, the things he had felt, they were illogical. They were meaningless trash, and yet, they had felt more real than the cold certainty of his own nihilism. The sensation lingered, a phantom warmth in the cold void of his chest. Trash, he hissed, the word a desperate rejection of what he had just experienced. Sentimental trash. He raised his hand to fire another Sero, to blast away the confusing warmth with the cold, familiar power of destruction. But he hesitated. His hand trembled slightly. The absolute certainty that Ha-D defined his entire being had been fractured. A seed of doubt had been planted in the barren soil of his soul. With a sound of pure frustration, he lowered his hand. The analysis is complete, he stated, the words sounding forced. A retreat to the familiarity of his mission. Your threat level is incalculable. He turned, and with another flicker of his perfect sonito, he was gone. The oppressive cold vanished with him. The sun's warmth returned, the colors of the oasis flooded back into existence, and the sound of the babbling brooks resumed. It was as if the world had taken a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. A collective sigh of relief went through the assembled Arankar. Mila Rose lowered her sword, her knuckles white. What in the world was that? She breathed. You didn't even hit him. I didn't need to, Naruto said, turning back to them. His own heart will do the rest. Harribel stared at Naruto, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. She had been prepared for a battle of gods. A clash of apocalyptic energies that would reshape the desert. Instead, she had seen a duel of philosophies. She had seen Naruto face down absolute despair, not with a greater power, but with a greater truth. He hadn't defeated Ulquiorra. He had healed him. Or had at least begun the process. He had shown her that his greatest strength wasn't the sun he commanded or the energy he wielded. It was his profound, unshakable emotional clarity. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The incident with Ulquiorra had changed something in the oasis. The fear and uncertainty among the refugees had been replaced by a quiet, awestruck reverence for Naruto. He had faced one of Aizen's strongest and had sent him away without throwing a single punch. He was not just a protector, he was a miracle. That night, the camp was quiet. Naruto had dimmed his sun, transforming it into a soft, silver orb that bathed the oasis in a gentle moonlight, a concession to the natural rhythms of creatures who had only ever known the night. Harribel found him sitting alone by the main stream, skipping stones across its surface. The simple, childish act was so at odds with the being of infinite power she knew him to be that it was almost jarring. She stood behind him in silence for a long moment, watching the ripples spread across the water. You could have killed him, she said finally. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. What would that have accomplished? He asked without turning around. Aizen would just send someone else. Maybe someone who isn't interested in talking. He is our enemy, she said, the words feeling strangely hollow. He serves the man who will stop at nothing to destroy us. He's not an enemy, Naruto said, tossing another stone. It skipped 7 times before sinking into the darkness. He's just a lost kid who needs to find his way home. He finally turned to look at her, his expression serious. Just like you were. Just like I was. The quiet understanding in his voice disarmed her completely. He saw the truth of her, the lonely predator fighting to protect the only family she had ever known, and he didn't judge it. He accepted it. She walked closer and sat on the grass beside him, a comfortable distance away. The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer tense or awkward. It was companionable. Why? She asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the day he arrived. Why are you doing this? You have no stake in our war. You owe us nothing. You could create this oasis anywhere in this world, or any other, and live in peace. Why stay here? Why fight our battles? Naruto stopped skipping stones. He looked up at the silver orb in the sky, his moon, and his expression grew distant, filled with a melancholy that seemed as ancient as the stars. For a long time, he began, his voice barely a whisper, I was the most powerful person in my world. I became Hokage. I brought an era of peace my teachers could only dream of. I had friends, family, respect. I had everything I ever wanted. He paused, and the silence was heavy with unspoken loss. But I kept living, and they didn't. People I loved grew old. They died. The world changed. New generations were born, and to them, I wasn't a hero anymore. I was a monument, a relic, a story their grandparents told them. He looked down at his hands. I outlived everyone. I became alone, an old god in a world that didn't need me anymore. So I left. I put myself to sleep, drifted between the worlds, looking for, I don't know. An end, maybe. A quiet place. He turned his head, and his piercing blue eyes met hers in the soft, silver light. His gaze was intense, vulnerable, and absolutely sincere. And then I woke up here. And I saw you, and your friends. He gestured vaguely toward the sleeping camp. I saw people fighting to survive, fighting for each other. I saw a queen who carried the weight of her entire world on her shoulders and refused to break. I felt that void, the one that's starting to eat this world from the inside out. And I realized I hadn't found an end. I'd found a reason. He held her gaze, and in that moment, the chasm between them, God and Arankar, idealist and pragmatist, vanished. She saw only the truth of him, the lonely boy who had saved the world and then lost it to time, the powerful being who craved nothing more than a bond to anchor him. I stay, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, because for the first time in centuries, I see people worth protecting. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, breaking through the last of her carefully constructed walls, touching the very core of her being. He wasn't staying for power, or for glory, or out of some abstract sense of duty. He was staying for her. For them. She didn't know what to say. The language of tactics and warfare failed her. For the first time, Tear Harribel, the Tercera Espada, the Shark Queen of Hueco Mundo, felt her heart. The one she had long considered a liability, beat with a fierce, terrifying, and undeniable rhythm. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that her world had not just been illuminated by his sun. It had been irrevocably and completely changed by his presence. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. The Thirsting Sands. The sickness began as a whisper. A subtle lethargy, a dulling of the sharp, predatory instincts that kept an Arankar alive. Then came the tremors, a fine, uncontrollable shaking in the hands of hardened warriors. Their sorrows, when they could summon the strength to form them at all, were weak and sputtering. Like damp fireworks, the air, once so rich and nourishing within the oasis, had begun to taste like ash. The reishi was thin, like watered-down wine, offering substance but no satisfaction. The gnawing hunger, which Naruto's presence had so miraculously suppressed, was returning, but it was different now. It was twisted, accompanied by a spiritual nausea and a deep, unsettling thirst that no amount of water from his streams could quench. Panic, a far more virulent contagion, followed close behind. The fragile peace of the oasis shattered. Fights broke out over perceived slights. Old territorial disputes resurfacing with renewed venom. The refugees who had flocked to their banner were now viewed with suspicion and resentment by Harribel's original followers. Every mouth was a drain on a dwindling resource. The hope that Naruto had so carefully cultivated was beginning to curdle into fear. Harribel stood atop the same rise she always did, but her view was no longer one of a burgeoning kingdom. It was a pressure cooker, the lid beginning to rattle. Mila Rose and Apache were in the thick of it, their roars and shows of force barely enough to keep the factions from tearing each other apart. Sun was at her side, her face grim. "It's getting worse, Lady Harribel," she reported, her voice stripped of its usual silken calm. "The ambient reishi is not just dissipating. It's being corrupted, degraded. Consuming it is like trying to survive on spoiled food. It fills the stomach but poisons the body." She held up a hand, and a faint, sickly gray aura flickered around her fingers. "Even our own spiritual reserves are being affected. We are all weakening." Harribel's gaze was fixed on a point in the far distance, beyond the shimmering heat haze of the desert. She could feel it, the source of the decay. It was the same dead, static quality she had felt in the sea of bones where her patrol had vanished. That patch of emptiness was growing, spreading like a gangrenous infection across Hueco Mundo, and its septic influence was finally reaching them. The Kokyo, the void progenitor. It wasn't just killing her people, it was starving them. Her mind, honed by a lifetime of brutal choices, went to the only logical, if terrible, solution. Triage. She found Naruto by the main stream, which now flowed sluggishly, the water still clear but lacking the vibrant energy it once held. He was kneeling beside a young Urankar, no older than a teenager, whose body was racked with violent shivers. Naruto had placed a hand on the boy's forehead, his own golden energy flowing into him. Not to heal, but simply to soothe, to offer a moment of respite from the pain. The act was one of profound, and in Harribel's view, pointless compassion. She waited until he was finished. Until the boy's shivers had subsided into a fitful sleep. He stood and turned to face her, his expression weary. The constant, low-level effort of sustaining the Oasis Aga, the encroaching corruption was taking a visible toll on him. "We have a problem," she stated, foregoing any preamble. "I know," he said, his blue eyes troubled. "It feels like the world itself is getting sick. I can pour more energy into the land, but it's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. The life I create is being drained away by something. It is the enemy that took my scouts," she confirmed. "And it is winning. My people are growing sick and desperate. The camp is on the verge of tearing itself apart. We are running out of time and resources. So we find the source of the sickness and we destroy it," he said, his conviction a familiar, solid presence. "That could take days, weeks," she countered, her voice hard. "We don't have that long. The weaker ones are already showing signs of spiritual degradation. At this rate, they will be dead in a matter of days. The stronger ones will follow. We must act now to preserve our core strength." He watched her, his expression narrowing slightly, sensing the direction of her thoughts. "What are you proposing?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We consolidate. The Oasis can no longer support this many. We must reduce the population." The words were cold, clinical, stripped of all emotion. "We drive out the refugees who came seeking shelter. We keep only my original forces, the ones whose loyalty is proven and whose strength is a true asset. We ration the remaining pure reishi. We cut away the infected limbs to save the body. It is the only logical choice." Naruto stared at her, and the warmth in his eyes was replaced by a flash of ice. It was the first time she had ever seen him look at her with genuine anger. No, the single word was not a shout. It was a flat, absolute negation. "Allah, you letting sentiment cloud your judgment." She shot back, her own frustration boiling over. "This is not a moral debate, it is a matter of survival. Your ideal of protecting everyone is a fantasy that is going to get us all killed. We have to make a choice. We have to sacrifice the few to save the many." "There it is again," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Sacrifice. You think that word makes it noble. You think it makes you strong. It doesn't. It's a coward's word. It's the excuse you use when you're not strong enough to find a better way." The accusation struck her like a physical blow. Coward. No one had ever dared to call her that. Her entire life had been a testament to her courage, her willingness to stand and fight when others fled. "How dare you?" she hissed, her Ryutsu flaring around her like a furious golden storm. "I have fought and bled and killed to protect my family. I have made choices that would have broken a lesser soul, all for their sake. You know nothing of my struggles. I know everything about them." He roared back, and for the first time, the full, unrestrained force of his power slammed into her. The very air cracked with the pressure, the ground shaking beneath her feet. It wasn't the calm, placid ocean she was used to, it was a raging, apocalyptic tsunami. "I know what it's like to be hungry. I know what it's like to have the entire world look at you like you're a monster. I know what it's like to be alone. And I know that the moment you decide one life is worth less than another, you've already lost." The raw, unfiltered pain and rage in his voice stunned her into silence. Her own flaring Ryutsu was snuffed out like a candle in a hurricane. She saw in his eyes not the serene god, but the outcast child, the hated Jinchuriki, the lonely warrior. His power receded as quickly as it had come, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. He took a deep, shuddering breath, running a hand through his spiky hair. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice strained. "I shouldn't have, but you're wrong, Harribel. Your way isn't the only way. If the bucket has a hole, you don't ration the water. You find a damned river." He turned his back on her and walked toward the center of the oasis. To the very spot where he had first appeared. "Get your people back," he called over his shoulder. "All of them. Tell them to brace themselves." Confused and still reeling from his outburst, she did as he commanded. She sent her Fracken to restore order, to pull the brawling Urankar apart and gather everyone toward the center. A nervous energy filled the camp as hundreds of Urankar, sick and weak, formed a wide, uncertain circle around Naruto. He stood in the middle of them all, his eyes closed. "Kurama," he whispered, a name spoken not with his voice, but in the quiet space of his own soul. "You feeling up for a little landscaping?" A deep, rumbling chuckle echoed in his mind, a voice of ancient power and grudging affection. "It's been a while since we built something instead of breaking it. Don't strain yourself, Kit." Naruto smiled. He sank into a cross-legged position, the same as the day he arrived. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just meditating. He was gathering. He placed his palms flat on the dying grass. "Sage art," he breathed, and the world changed. Brilliant orange markings bloomed around his eyes, the sign of a perfect sage mode. But it went further. His skin took on a golden, incandescent glow, black markings spreading across his body like sacred text. A halo of 9 black spheres, the truth-seeking orbs, materialized, hovering silently behind him. He had not just tapped into nature, he had merged with it, becoming the nexus point between the life energy of his own world and the starved reishi of Hueco Mundo. Harribel watched from the edge of the circle, her heart pounding in her chest. This was a level of power she hadn't even glimpsed before. This was not the strength of a warrior. This was the raw, untamed power of creation. The ground began to tremble. It was not the violent shaking of an earthquake, but a deep, resonant hum, the thrum of a world's heart being restarted. Naruto's golden chakra, pure and untainted, poured from his hands into the earth. It was not a flood, but a deliberate, intricate injection of life. He was pushing back against the encroaching corruption, not by force, but by overwhelming it with sheer, unadulterated vitality. The grass at his feet exploded with color, a wave of vibrant green that spread outwards, chasing away the sickly gray. But it didn't stop there. From the newly rejuvenated earth, things began to grow. First came the trees, not the petrified quartz husks of Hueco Mundo, but real, living trees. Thick, sturdy trunks of brown and white bark erupted from the ground. Their roots digging deep into the sand, anchoring themselves with terrifying speed. Branches sprouted, and from them, leaves unfurled, 1,000 shades of green, rustling in a wind that hadn't existed moments before. They grew with impossible speed, reaching heights of 50, then 100 feet, their canopies forming a lush, protective roof over the oasis. Then came the water. The sluggish streams began to churn. The ground in the center of the oasis bulged, then broke apart, and a geyser of pure, crystal-clear water shot 100 feet into the air. It was not just water, it was liquid life. It fell back to earth, carving a massive basin that widened and deepened, forming a vast, serene lake where there had once been only sand. The air itself changed. The sickly, thin reishi was purged, replaced by an atmosphere so thick with pure, clean energy that it was almost intoxicating. The trees, the water, the very soil, they were all radiating it, a self-sustaining, ever-renewing source of life. The sick Urankar, who had been huddled in misery, began to stir. They took a breath, then another, their bodies absorbing the pure energy. The tremors stopped. The spiritual nausea faded. The color returned to their skin. A collective gasp of pure, unadulterated awe swept through the crowd. They weren't just healed. They were being remade, their spiritual cores refilled and strengthened. Harribel stood frozen, a silent witness to the miracle. She looked at the impossible forest, the shimmering lake, the healthy, revitalized forms of her people. She had proposed to cut away the dead limbs, and he had responded by growing a new forest. She had offered a solution born from a lifetime of scarcity, and he had answered with an act of infinite abundance. Her entire philosophy, her entire understanding of the world, crumbled into dust in the face of this beautiful, terrifying reality. The act of creation lasted for 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When it was over, the oasis was gone. In its place was a thriving, vibrant forest surrounding a pristine lake, an Eden in the heart of hell. Naruto's power receded. The golden glow faded. The sage markings vanished. He slumped forward, caught before he hit the ground by a wave of sand that rose to cushion him, a reflexive act of this newly awakened world to protect its creator. He was pale, his breathing heavy, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. Creating a world, it turned out, was exhausting. The Urankar did not rush forward. They stared, their expressions a mixture of fear, reverence, and a dawning, fanatical loyalty. They were looking at the man who had not just saved them, but had given them a paradise. Later that night, after the fervor had died down, Harribel found him sitting at the edge of the new lake, skipping stones across its glassy surface. He looked tired, but content. Vulnerable. She sat beside him, the silence comfortable, familiar. How? She asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. He shrugged, not even looking at her. My power comes from life energy. From the connections between things. The corruption was trying to sever those connections. So I just made new ones. Stronger ones. He finally turned to her, a faint, tired smile on his face. I remembered what it felt like to lie in the grass in the forests around Konoha, listening to the world breathe. I just asked this place if it wouldn't mind breathing, too. His simple, poetic explanation was more profound than any technical treatise. He hadn't commanded the world. He had asked it. The choices I made, she began, her voice quiet. The words tasting like a confession. The philosophy of sacrifice, it was not born from a desire for strength. It was born from desperation. She looked out over the water, seeing ghosts in its reflection. When it was just me and my Fracken, long before Aizen, we were just Vasto Lord trying to survive. There was never enough reishi, never enough safety. I was constantly faced with the choice. Do I feed one of them, or let both of them starve? Do I risk a fight for a scrap of food that might get us all killed? I learned to cut losses. I Ned that to protect what was most important. Sometimes you have to let go of the rest. He listened, his gaze soft with an understanding that soothed the old, raw wounds of her memory. I know, he said quietly. When I was a kid, I was always hungry. The villagers, they wouldn't sell me fresh food. I lived off instant ramen and whatever was about to expire. I used to stare through the windows of restaurants, watching families eat together, and I felt so empty. He looked at her, his blue eyes reflecting the silver light of his moon on the water. That hunger never really went away. It's why I can't stand to see anyone else go hungry. It's why I became Hokage. To create a home where everyone had a place at the table. In that shared moment, in their mutual confessions of hunger and desperation, a final wall between them dissolved. She was not just a queen and he was not just a god. They were two lonely souls who had spent their entire lives fighting to feed and protect the people they cared about. In a world that had given them nothing, she reached out, her movement hesitant, and placed her hand on one of the new trees beside her. She could feel it, a slow, steady pulse of life thrumming through the bark. A heartbeat in the wood. It was the rhythm of his hope, made real. "You were right," she whispered, the admission a surrender and a liberation all at once. This is a better way. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6. A door to a drowning world. The forest was a miracle, but it was also a cage. A beautiful, life-giving cage surrounded by a dying world. The Kokio's influence, that creeping, spiritual gangrene, had been pushed back by Naruto's act of creation, but it had not been defeated. It lapped at the edges of their new sanctuary like a tide of nothingness, a constant, silent pressure against the vibrant life within. The Arankar were safe, healed and fed by the bountiful reishi of the forest, but they were trapped. To leave was to walk into a world that would starve and poison them. The paradise had become a fortress under siege. Naruto stood with Harribel on the highest branch of the tallest tree, a colossal, white-barked behemoth that acted as a central pillar for their new home, which they had started calling Arbor de Vida, the Tree of Life. From this vantage point, they could see the stark, circular border of their domain. Inside, a lush, breathing ecosystem. Outside, the endless, thirsty sands, now tinged with a sickly, gray pallor that seemed to absorb the light. "It's expanding," Naruto said, his sage-enhanced senses painting a grim picture in his mind. He could feel the corruption spreading, not like a flood, but like a network of fine cracks spider-webbing through the very foundation of this dimension. It's slow, but it's methodical. It's not just eating reishi anymore. It's unraveling the fabric of space. "We cannot stay here forever," Harribel stated, her gaze fixed on the blighted horizon. "My people are warriors, not farmers. This peace, it's making them soft. An army that does not fight, forgets how. And a world that doesn't breathe, dies," he finished for her. "We can't just keep patching the hole. We need to find the leak." He turned to her, his expression serious. "The last time I felt anything like this, it was from a woman who could create and travel through dimensions. This emptiness feels like the opposite of her power. It's not an attack, it's a fundamental failure, a universal law being erased. An anti-power," Harribel mused, the tactical part of her mind latching onto the concept. "Then we are fighting a principle, not an army. We need information. A weapon is useless if you do not know where to aim it." She paused, her eyes growing distant, dredging up a memory from the deepest recesses of her long existence. A legend, a whisper among the oldest of the Vasto Lord, a story told to frighten lesser hollows away from the darkest corners of their world. "There is a place," she said slowly. "A legend. The Forest of Manos. Most believe it to be nothing more than the breeding ground for Jillian-class hollows, a place of mindless chaos. But the oldest stories say that at its very heart, where Reishi is at its most dense and ancient, there exists a library." "A library?" Naruto asked, intrigued. "Not of books," she clarified. "Of memories. A repository. The Manos are a collective consciousness of souls. The theory is that the oldest of them, the ones who have existed since the dawn of this world, have absorbed the memories of countless beings. They say there is a single, ancient entity at the forest's core that acts as a keeper of these memories. If the history of the Kokio exists anywhere, it will be there." "Then that's where we're going," he said with a decisive nod. "Just the two of us. It is the only way," she confirmed. "The forest is a labyrinth of immense spiritual pressure. Taking an army would be suicide. They would be crushed by the sheer density of it before we even reached the core. Only those with the power of an Espada or greater can survive the journey." The decision was made. They delegated command of the oasis to her Fracken, a choice that was met with fierce but ultimately accepting protests. Mila Rose, Apache, and Sun Sun had become the unwavering pillars of the new community, their loyalty to Harribel now extending to a grudging, deep-seated respect for Naruto and his impossible ideals. Their journey began at the edge of the forest, stepping from the vibrant life of their sanctuary back into the gray, dying desert. The transition was jarring. The air grew thin and sharp. The silence absolute. Naruto's sun followed them, a small, personal star against the eternal black sky, a defiant spark of hope in the oppressive gloom. They traveled for hours, their Sonito and his enhanced speed eating up the miles. The landscape grew more twisted and menacing the further they went. The petrified quartz trees became denser, their skeletal forms reaching like grasping claws. The very ground seemed to groan under the weight of ancient despair. Finally, they saw it. A dark line on the horizon that was not a shadow, but a solid wall of black. As they drew closer, it resolved into trees, but unlike any they had seen before. They were colossal, ink-black pillars that seemed to absorb the light, their tops lost in the perpetual twilight. This was the forest of Manos. The spiritual pressure rolling off it in waves was suffocating, a physical weight that would have brought a lesser being to their knees. The pressure here is heavy, Naruto commented, his senses adjusting. But it's not malicious. It's just old. The forest itself is a living entity, Harribel explained, her hand resting on the hilt of her Zanpakuto. It does not welcome intruders. Be on your guard. They stepped past the first line of trees, and the world changed. The pale moonlight and the light from Naruto's sun were swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The only illumination came from the faint, eerie glow of the reishi-rich moss that coated the bark of the trees. The air was thick and humid, filled with the sounds of 1,000 skittering, unseen things in the distant moaning roar of the forest's mindless inhabitants. They moved through the undergrowth, no longer with blinding speed, but with the cautious grace of hunters. The forest was a disorienting maze, the paths twisting and turning back on themselves. Compasses and spiritual senses were unreliable here. The sheer density of the reishi created false echoes and phantom presences. We navigate by instinct, Harribel murmured, her eyes scanning the darkness. The core pulls everything toward it. We must feel for the strongest current in the reishi. They fell into a natural rhythm, their decades of combat experience creating a seamless partnership. Harribel took the lead, her keen, predatory senses cutting through the deceptive environment, her movements fluid and precise. Naruto followed a pace behind, a silent guardian. His own sensory abilities a vast, protective net, feeling for threats before they could even manifest. The first attack came without warning. A colossal, sentiped, eel-like Ijukas erupted from the ground beneath them, its maw filled with 1,000 needle-like teeth, its roar a physical blow. Harribel didn't even turn. Naruto. He was already moving. Rasengan. A swirling sphere of pure, destructive chakra appeared in his hand. He didn't aim for a killing blow. He slammed the sphere into the side of the creature's head. The impact sent the massive hollow careening sideways, its armored carapace cracking as it smashed through a dozen of the black trees before crashing to the ground, stunned and disoriented. Before it could recover, Harribel acted. She spun, drawing her massive Zanpakuto in a fluid arc. Ola Azul, she commanded. A high-pressure blade of focused blue reishi shot from the tip of her sword, striking the dazed Ijukas directly in the mask, splitting it cleanly in two. The creature dissolved into fading particles. The entire engagement had lasted less than 5 seconds. They didn't even break stride. Nice shot, he commented. You created the opening, she replied, her tone professional, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. They pushed deeper. The threats grew more frequent, more bizarre. A pack of shadow wolves that could phase through the trees. A giant, plant-like hollow that used thorny vines to ensnare its prey. A swarm of bat-like creatures whose shrieks could disorient the senses. Each time, they met the threat with an effortless, synchronized violence. Her precise, water-like attacks complemented his overwhelming, elemental power perfectly. She was the scalpel, he was the sledgehammer. Together, they were unstoppable. Finally, the trees began to thin, opening into a vast, circular clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a single, colossal tree that dwarfed all the others. It was ancient, its bark a gnarled, pale white, and it pulsed with a faint, internal light. The spiritual pressure here was immense, a crushing, silent weight. But guarding the tree was something else. It was a hollow, but unlike any they had ever seen. It was vaguely humanoid, but its body was a grotesque fusion of bone, root, and shadow, its form seeming to shift and writhe as if it wasn't entirely solid. It was easily the size of a Jillian, but it radiated the focused, intelligent malice of a Vasto lord. It had no face, only a single, large, glowing red eye in the center of its chest. This was the guardian, the librarian. The creature's voice was not a sound, but a thought, projected directly into their minds. You seek knowledge. The price of knowledge is memory. To learn, you must give. Offer a memory of true despair. If it is worthy, You may enter. If not, you will be consumed. Harribel tensed, her hand tightening on her sword. A memory of despair. Her life was a tapestry woven from it. Which one to choose? The loss of her comrades. The brutal reality of her evolution. But Naruto stepped forward, his expression calm. All right, he said, speaking aloud. I'll go first. He closed his eyes, and a single, perfect tear trickled down his cheek. He didn't relive the memory. He projected it. The clearing around them dissolved, replaced by a vision. They were in Konoha, under a sky the color of blood. A monstrous, nine-tailed fox of pure, malevolent chakra was roaring, its tails leveling mountains. A younger, blonde-haired man, the fourth Hokage, Minato Namikaze, stood before it, his face a mask of desperate resolve. A red-haired woman, Kushina Uzumaki, was held in chains of chakra, her body weak, but her eyes filled with a fierce, maternal love. And between them, a newborn baby, crying in the night. They watched in silent horror as the vision played out. The sacrifice, the sealing, the final, loving words of parents to a son who would never know them. The crushing weight of a village's hatred placed upon the shoulders of a tiny, innocent child. They felt the profound, absolute loneliness of the orphan boy, staring at the smiling faces of other families, his own heart a hollow, aching void. The vision faded, leaving an echo of unbearable sorrow in the air. The guardian was silent for a long moment. The red eye in its chest pulsed slowly. The despair of the abandoned child, who becomes unwilling cage for the beast that orphaned him. A worthy price. The pain is exquisite. You may pass. A doorway of light opened in the trunk of the massive tree. Naruto wiped the tear from his cheek, his expression unreadable. Harribel looked at him, her own heart aching with a shared grief she had no words for. She now understood the source of his impossible empathy, the wellspring of his determination to protect everyone. He was ensuring no one would ever have to feel the way he once did. They stepped through the doorway and into a world of pure information. They were floating in an endless, starlit void. There were no walls, no floor, no ceiling. All around them, shimmering, ethereal threads of light drifted like cosmic dust. Each thread was a memory, a life, a soul's experience. It was a nexus of consciousness. The collective history of Hawako Mundo. Where do we even start? Naruto breathed, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. The oldest threads, Harribel said, her focus absolute. The ones with the most weight. She reached out, her senses guiding her past the memories of recent centuries, past the creation of the Arankar, past the long wars of the Vasto Lord. She searched for something primordial. Something that felt like a foundation stone of this world. She found it. A thick, heavy cord of light that pulsed with an energy that was ancient and terrifying. She grabbed it, and Naruto, sensing her intent, placed his hand over hers. The moment they made contact, the memory consumed them. Their perspective shifted. They were no longer themselves. They were looking through the eyes of the original Soul King, a being of such immense, indescribable power that their minds could barely comprehend it. Before them was a canvas of pure, infinite possibility. There was no soul society, no Hawako Mundo, no human world. There was only the potential for them. But something was wrong. A flaw in the canvas. A patch of anti-existence. A sentient, hungry void that was consuming potential. Erasing creation before it could even begin. The Kokyo. They witnessed the battle. It was not a clash of swords or energy blasts. It was a war of concepts. The Soul King, a being of absolute existence, fought against the Kokyo, a being of absolute non-existence. The king would create a universe, and the Kokyo would unmake it. It was an eternal, unwinnable stalemate. Finally, the Soul King realized he could not destroy the void. He could only contain it. With a supreme act of will, he sacrificed the majority of his power, his very limbs, to forge a cage of reality. He tore existence into three separate, balanced parts, the three worlds, creating a cosmic tripod of stability. At the center of this new structure, he created a seal, a lock forged from the very laws of causality, and imprisoned the Kokyo within it. He became the linchpin, the living key that maintained the balance and kept the seal intact. The vision shifted. Millennia passed in an instant. They saw Aizen, a brilliant but arrogant Shinigami, discover the legend of the Hogyoku, an object that could dissolve the boundaries between souls. They watched as he created his own, believing it to be the key to godhood. Then the vision focused, showing them something their minds could barely handle. The Hogyoku was not just a key. It was a resonating chamber. Aizen's ambition, his desire to break down the boundaries of the worlds, was a frequency that vibrated through the Hogyoku and struck the Soul King's ancient seal. It was weakening it, causing the first small cracks to appear. Then, the final, horrifying revelation. Naruto's arrival, his power, a force of pure, positive life energy from another dimension, was anathema to the seal. It was a hammer striking the weakened lock. His very presence in this reality, his act of creating the oasis, was accelerating the decay, forcing the cracks to widen. Aizen's Hogyoku was the key. Naruto's existence was the force turning it. The vision shattered, throwing them back into their own minds. They stumbled out of the tree, back into the dark clearing, the knowledge they had gained a crushing weight on their souls. The guardian's voice echoed one last time. The king of existence, the progenitor of nothingness, the fool of ambition, the child of prophecy. The cycle begins anew. The drowning is inevitable. It faded back into the shadows of the forest, leaving them alone with the terrible truth. They were no longer just fighting for their small corner of the world. They were standing on the precipice of a cosmic crisis that threatened to unmake all three realms. Aizen, in his blind ambition, was unwittingly about to unleash an apocalypse far beyond his ability to control. And Naruto, the savior, the protector, was the catalyst for the end of everything. Chapter 6 End. Chapter 7. The Winter War's True Shadow. The journey back from the forest of Manos was a silent pilgrimage. The oppressive darkness of the woods had been replaced by the vast, open emptiness of the desert. But the weight in the air remained, heavier than any spiritual pressure. It was the weight of knowledge. The crushing, absolute certainty of their own doom. They moved as blurs of white and orange across the gray sands, the silence between them a universe of unspoken terror. Aizen was not the true enemy. He was a fool, a brilliant, arrogant child playing with a cosmic lockpick. Convinced the tremors he caused were the herald of his own ascension. Harribel, the pragmatist, found the irony bitter. All her life, she had fought tangible threats, beings of flesh and power. Now, her greatest foe was a concept, a principle of non-existence, and the key to its victory was the very man who had become her world's greatest hope. Naruto ran beside her, his personal sun a dim, troubled gold above them. He was the catalyst. His life, his power, his very presence was a poison to the ancient seal. The revelation had settled deep within him, not as guilt, but as a profound, aching responsibility. It was the curse of the Jinchuriki, magnified to a cosmic scale. In his youth, he had carried a demon that threatened his village. Now, he carried a hope that threatened all of existence. The parallels were so cruel, so perfectly symmetrical, that he could almost hear the universe laughing. "It's my fault," he said finally, his voice cutting through the sound of their high-speed movement. The words were not an apology. They were a diagnosis. "No," Harribel countered, her gaze fixed forward. "Fault implies intent. Aizen has intent. You were merely a consequence." Her mind, always moving, was already processing the tactical realities. "The information changes nothing about our immediate objective. We must still defend our people. We must still grow stronger." "It changes everything," he said, his voice raw. "How can I protect them when my own power is what's inviting the wolf to the door? Every time I use my energy to shield them, I'm pushing against the seal, making it weaker. To protect them is to endanger them." It was the ultimate paradox, a tactical nightmare with no solution. It was the kind of moral trap that broke leaders. "Then we find another way," she said, her voice a blade of pure, unyielding resolve. She glanced at him, her teal eyes catching the dim light. "We did not come this far to drown in despair. We have the knowledge. Aizen does not. That is our advantage. We will use it." Her certainty was an anchor. It did not solve the problem, but it steadied him. She was right. This was not the time for self-recrimination. It was time for action. They were in this together. They arrived at the edge of Arbor de Vita to a scene of disciplined order. Her Fracken had performed admirably. Defensive patrols circled the perimeter, a proper watch. had been established in the high branches of the great trees, and the populace of Arankar, though still anxious, had been organized into a functioning community. For the first time, it looked less like a refugee camp and more like a military encampment in a paradise. But the moment Naruto and Harribel stepped back into the sanctuary, the illusion of peace was shattered by a new, encroaching dread. Naruto froze, his head snapping up, his gaze distant. "It's starting," he whispered. "What is?" Harribel asked, her hand instinctively going to her sword. "The war," he said, his sage senses reaching across the dimensional divide. Drawn by the pulsing of the Hogyoku, he could feel it, a tremendous, chaotic clash of spiritual pressures in the world of the living. He could sense the overwhelming power of the Gote 13's captains, the cold ambition of Aizen, the desperate struggle over a single, sleeping town. Aizen was making his move. The key was being inserted into the lock. He could feel the Hogyoku, now embedded in Aizen's chest, resonating with his own power. It was a faint, sickening hum at the base of his soul, a sympathetic vibration that made his teeth ache. The two greatest concentrations of anomalous power in the three worlds were now active, and the ancient seal that separated existence from oblivion was caught between them, groaning under the strain. The sky above their forest began to flicker. The eternal, pale moonlight of Hueco Mundo wavered, as if the projector bulb was failing. The Arankar below stopped their duties, looking up in confusion and fear. "Something's wrong," Apache growled, landing on the branch beside them. "The reishi, it's vibrating. I've never felt anything like it." Naruto closed his eyes, focusing. He could feel the seal, not as a physical object, but as a concept. It was a great, cosmic equation that kept the universe in balance, and he could feel the numbers being erased. "Aizen's using the Hogyoku's power to fight the Shinigami," he murmured, piecing it together. "Every time he does, it sends a shockwave through the seal. And my presence here, it's acting like an amplifier. It's going to break, right now." As he spoke the words, the world went silent. It was not a gradual quieting. It was instantaneous and absolute. The rustle of leaves, the murmur of the crowd, the distant howl of a desert hollow, all of it ceased. Sound itself had been erased. The flickering moonlight was extinguished, plunging Hueco Mundo into a blackness so profound it felt solid. Naruto's sun, his loyal companion, flickered violently and died, its light devoured by the oppressive, absolute dark. Then, they saw it. High above Las Noches, miles away but clear as day in the unnatural emptiness, the non-existent sky began to unravel. It did not tear or shatter. It came apart, like old cloth. The very threads of reality fraying and dissolving into nothing. In the center of the unraveling, a line appeared. It was a line of perfect, geometric blackness. A razor-thin cut in the skin of the world. It was a silence made visible, a void given form. The line expanded, not with a roar or an explosion, but with the silent, inexorable speed of a thought. It grew into a vast, gaping rift. A wound in the universe that bled pure, unadulterated nothingness. Every soul in Hueco Mundo felt it. In the grand throne room of Las Noches, where the remaining espada waited, Coyote Stark, who had been lazily sleeping on his throne, shot bolt upright, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with laziness. His other half, Lilinet Jingerbuck, let out a piercing shriek of pure, instinctual fear. This was not the pressure of an enemy. This was the pressure of an ending. From the silent, black wound in the sky, things began to emerge. They were not creatures of flesh or spirit. They were horrors of geometry and absence. Some were vaguely insectoid, their limbs not appendages but holes in space, their movements a silent, gliding horror. Others were shifting, crystalline constructs that refracted the absence of light, their very presence a contradiction that made the eyes water and the mind rebel. They were the Kokio's vanguard. The unmade. They poured from the rift in a silent, endless tide, a river of oblivion flowing into a dying world. Panic, raw and absolute, erupted in Arbor de Vida. The disciplined order shattered. The Arankar, Bay, NGS whose entire existence was defined by their spiritual power and their ability to fight, were faced with an enemy that seemed to exist outside those rules. The tide of unmade flowed across the desert, their target not Las Noches. Not the oasis, but everything. They were an acid, dissolving the world itself. The gray sand they passed over vanished, leaving behind a creeping slick of pure black nothing. A brave, or foolish, squad of Arankar on the perimeter flew out to meet them, led by hulking warrior Harribel, recognized as one of her lieutenants. "For Lady Harribel," he roared, his voice thin and small in the face of the silent apocalypse. He and his squad unleashed a volley of Seros, brilliant beams of red and blue that tore through the night. The beams struck the vanguard of the unmade and simply vanished. They were not blocked or absorbed. They were erased from existence the moment they touched the creatures' impossible forms. The unmade did not retaliate. They simply continued their advance. The lieutenant, his bravado crumbling into terror, found himself face to face with one of the shifting crystalline horrors. He swung his Zanpakuto in a desperate arc. The blade passé through the creature as if through smoke, yet the moment it made contact, the steel dissolved into black motes. The creature reached out with an appendage that was a vortex of emptiness. It touched the Arankar's shoulder. He didn't scream in pain. His scream was one of pure, existential terror as his arm, his shoulder, then his torso, dissolved. Not into reishi, not into blood and gore, but into the same black, crumbling nothingness that was consuming the sand. His very being, his soul, his memories, his existence, were being deleted. In 3 seconds, he was gone. The sight broke the Arankar army. This was not a battle. This was an extinction event. The Arankar turned and fled, a stampede of terror back towards the relative safety of the forest. "Form a line." Harribel's voice was a thunderclap of command, cutting through the rising tide of panic. Her mind had processed the horror and had moved instantly to damage control. "Do not engage. Fall back to the great tree. Defensive circle, now." Her Fracken, their own faces pale with terror, were the first to obey, their loyalty to her a bulwark against the chaos. They began to herd the panicked soldiers, their own power a reassuring, if small, beacon in the overwhelming darkness. Naruto stood beside Harribel, his eyes fixed on the approaching tide of nothingness. His analytical mind, honed by 1,000 battles, saw the truth. Their weapons were useless. Their power was irrelevant. This was a conflict of concepts. Life versus nothingness. Existence versus the void. And he was the living incarnation of existence. "Get them inside the forest," he said to Harribel, his voice calm and steady, an island of certainty in the storm. "It's the only place I can protect them." He took a step forward, leaving the relative safety of the branches and planting his feet on the corrupted sand at the edge of his creation. He held out his hands, palms facing the oncoming horde. He took a deep breath, and the world ignited in gold. A wave of pure, condensed life energy erupted from him. It was not an attack. It was a declaration, a statement of being. A dome of shimmering, golden light expanded outwards, covering the entire forest of Arbor de Vida. It was a perfect hemisphere of existence, a shield forged from the raw power of the 10 tails and the life-giving energy of the Sage of 6 Paths. The unmade reached the golden wall. The moment their forms of non-existence touched the shield of pure life, they recoiled as if burned. They could not erase it. It was too real, too fundamentally alive. The silent, gliding horrors began to pile up against the barrier. A tide of blackness crashing against a shore of unbreakable gold. Inside the dome, the absolute darkness was banished. The forest was bathed in a warm, golden light that radiated from the barrier itself. The Arankar, who had been scrambling in panicked retreat, stumbled to a halt, staring at the golden sky above them and the wall of silent, writhing horrors pressed against it from the outside. They were trapped. They were surrounded. But they were, for the moment, safe. Naruto stood at the very edge of the barrier, a lone figure holding back the end of the world. The strain was immense. He could feel the unmade pressing against his shield, not with physical force, but with their very nature, a constant, abrasive pressure that sought to unmake his creation. It was like holding his hand in a river of antimatter. Harribel landed beside him, her Zanpakuto drawn, her body tense and ready. She looked at the silent, writhing mass of horrors pressed against the golden wall, then at him. His face was set in a grim line of concentration, sweat beading on his brow. The winter war, she breathed, the conflict in the world of the living suddenly seeming so distant, so laughably insignificant. Aizen's grand plan to overthrow the Soul King is now the least of anyone's problems, Naruto finished, his voice tight with effort. He wanted to sit on the throne of heaven. He just didn't realize heaven was about to be evicted. They stood together, the queen and the anomaly, their backs to the kingdom they had built, facing the silent, hungry void. The war for the Soul King's throne was over before it had even truly begun. The war for existence itself had just started. And their beautiful, impossible forest was now the last bastion of life in a world that was being systematically, silently, and completely erased. Chapter 7 End. Chapter 8. A Truce with the Devil. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the siege. The golden dome of Naruto's power was a solitary island of existence in an ocean of encroaching nullity. Outside, the silent, writhing legion of the unmade pressed against the barrier, their very nature an abrasive force that sought to unmake the light. Inside, an army of warriors could do nothing but watch. They were prisoners in their own sanctuary, their strength, their sorrows, their resurrections, all utterly useless against an enemy that could not be fought, only resisted. The entire weight of that resistance rested on the shoulders of one man. Naruto stood at the very edge of the forest, his feet planted on the living soil, his hands outstretched. The golden shield was an extension of his will, a projection of his own life force. For Harribel, standing a few feet behind him, it was like watching a man hold back the ocean with his bare hands. She could see the strain, the fine tremors in his arms, the way the muscles in his back were knotted with tension. The golden light of the shield, once so steady, now pulsed faintly. In time with his own laboring heart. He was not a god holding back the darkness with infinite power. He was a man, holding it back with finite, though immense, strength. And it was killing him. How long can you maintain this? She asked, her voice low, cutting through the eerie silence. Long enough, he gritted out, his gaze fixed on the roiling mass of nothingness outside. But not forever. It's not a wall, it's a conversation. They're arguing that nothing should exist, and I'm arguing back. It's tiring. The simplicity of his description was more terrifying than any technical explanation. He was in a philosophical duel with the end of the universe, and his only weapon was his own stubborn existence. A flicker. In the far right quadrant of the dome, the golden light thinned for a fraction of a second, becoming translucent. A dozen of the crystalline horrors outside pressed against the weakened point, and the barrier buckled inward, the light groaning like stressed glass. Naruto's head snapped in that direction, his concentration narrowing. No, you don't, he snarled, pouring more energy into the breach. The light flared, becoming an opaque, brilliant gold once more, shoving the creatures back. But the effort cost him. A line of blood trickled from his nose, and his breath hitched. He was bleeding stamina. He was bleeding life. And the enemy had no life to lose. They were tireless, infinite. It was in that moment of focused strain that the new arrival came. It was not the silent, creeping advance of the Kokyo. It was a violent, ragged scream of tearing space. 100 yards from the shield, the corrupted gray sand buckled, and a garganta ripped open. But it was not the clean, black vortex of a master's hand. This was a chaotic, unstable wound in reality, spitting sparks of chaotic energy. From it, 3 figures were violently ejected, tumbling onto the sand like discarded refuse. They were battered, their pristine white uniforms torn and scorched. Kanami Tosen was on one knee, his head bowed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Jin Ichimaru had lost his perpetual smile. His face was a grim mask of exertion, his zanpakuto drawn and dripping with a black, tar-like substance that dissolved into nothing as it hit the sand. And in the center was Sosuke Aizen. The master of control, the architect of destiny, was in disarray. His carefully styled hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, his robes were shredded, and a deep, cauterized gash ran along his cheek. But the most shocking thing was the look in his eyes. His usual placid, intellectual curiosity was gone, replaced by a cold, undiluted, and utterly incandescent fury. It was the fury of a god whose creation had been smashed by a thoughtless child, the rage of a king whose castle had dissolved into the sea. It took it, Aizen snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was barely audible through the shield. All of it, Los Noches, my army, gone, erased. He looked up, his gaze locking onto the golden dome. The only structure left standing in this dying world. He saw the island of life, the hundreds of Arankar within, and the man at its center holding back the tide. He saw his rival, his only hope. With a burst of sonido that tore up the sand, he appeared directly before the shield, his hand raised. Not to attack, to plead. Uzumaki, let me in. Harribel's reaction was instantaneous and visceral. No, she hissed, her ryutsu flaring. Let him rot. This is his doing. Her Fracken appeared at her side, their weapons drawn, their expressions murderous. The memory of Sun Sun's kidnapping was still a fresh, raw wound. He's right, Mila Rose roared. This apocalypse is the one he wanted. Let him enjoy it. Naruto didn't look at them. His eyes were locked with Aizen's. He saw past the fury, past the arrogance. He saw the cold, hard pragmatism of a being who had just watched his ambition turn to dust and now had only one move left on the board: survival. He'll try to kill you the second he's inside, Harribel warned, her voice tight with urgency. Maybe, Naruto grunted, the strain of maintaining the shield and focusing on the conversation making his voice tight. But he's more useful alive than dead. His brain, anyway. This is not the time for your impossible idealism. She shot back. This isn't idealism, he countered, his voice sharp. It's triage. I'm fighting a concept I barely understand. He's been studying this world's mechanics for a century. We need what he knows. He took a breath. I'm letting him in. If he tries anything, I'll end him. That's a promise. He didn't wait for her approval. With a subtle flex of his will, a small section of the golden shield became permeable. Aizen, Jin, and Tosen stumbled through, the warmth and vibrant life of the oasis hitting them like a physical blow after the dead chill of the outside world. The moment they were inside, the opening sealed. Harribel and her Fracken formed a wall of steel between the newcomers and Naruto. Their killing intent a palpable force. Aizen ignored them. He was staring, not at Naruto, but at the forest, the lake, the sheer, undeniable reality of the life around him. He, with the Hogyoku, had sought to evolve souls, to force reality to his will. This man had simply asked it to grow. The sheer, fundamental difference in their power was laid bare in this impossible Eden. You came to me with an offer once, Naruto said, his back still to Aizen as he focused on the shield. Now I'm making you one. You will give us everything you know about the Soul King, the dimensions, Kido. Anything and everything that can help us fight, that. He gestured with his head to the silent horrors outside. You will cooperate. You will follow my orders. In exchange, you get to exist for 5 more minutes. That's the deal. Aizen's lips twisted into a bitter, humorless smile. He, who had brought kings and captains to their knees with his words, was being dictated to. My, how the tables have turned. And if I refuse, then I'll throw you back out there, Naruto said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. And I'll let the void you helped unleash have you. I don't have time to bargain. Aizen. The tension was so thick it was a physical force. Harribel's hand was white on the hilt of her sword, every fiber of her being screaming to cut down the man who had manipulated and used her. Jin watched the scene, his usual grin replaced by a thin, predatory line, his hand never leaving his blade. It was into this powder keg that the second arrival came. A new light bloomed within the golden dome. It was a harsh, white light, filled with a sense of ancient, rigid order. A massive gate, a senkaimon, materialized in the center of the camp. It slid open, and from it stepped figures wreathed in an entirely different kind of power. The first was an old man, his frame deceptively frail, his eyes closed as if in meditation. But the spiritual pressure that rolled off him was a physical wave of heat, the air around him shimmering. Captain Commander Genryusai Shigekuni Yamamoto. The full, unrestrained weight of his ryutsu was a sun in its own right, a star of pure, righteous fury. Flanking him were 2 other captains. Shunsui Kyoraku, his pink kimono and lazy demeanor a stark contrast to the grim reality around them, his eyes sharp and observant beneath the rim of his straw hat. And Jashiro Yukitaki, his expression gentle but etched with a deep, weary concern, his hand resting near his twin blades. The Shinigami had arrived. Yamamoto's eyes snapped open, and they were like chips of burning coal. They swept over the scene, taking in the impossible forest, the army of Arankar, Harribel and her Fracken, Aizen and his cohorts, and finally, the blond man holding back the tide of nothingness. His gaze lingered on Aizen, and the temperature in the dome jumped by 50 degrees. Sosuke Aizen, Yamamoto's voice was the rumble of a volcano. Your treason ends here. I will incinerate you in every one of these hollow abominations and purge this world of your stain. He took a step forward, and the air ignited around him. His Shikai was not even released. But the sheer force of his intent was enough to make the very leaves on the trees curl and blacken. Now hold on there, old man Yama. Shunsui's voice was lazy, but it cut through the rising heat. He placed a hand on the captain commander's shoulder, a gesture of almost suicidal bravery. I don't think our little traitor is the biggest fire we need to put out right now. He gestured with his chin towards the golden barrier and the cosmic horror show unfolding beyond it. Unless you've got a plan for whatever that is. Yamamoto paused, his fiery gaze turning to the silent, writhing mass of the unmade. He felt their nature, the utter antithesis to the cycle of souls he had sworn to protect for a millennium. He saw the world outside the barrier being unmade, and a grim, cold fury replaced his personal vendetta. He understood. Aizen's rebellion was a gangrenous limb. This was a meteor aimed at the planet's heart. The situation had devolved into a perfect, three-way standoff. On one side, Harribel's Arankar, ready to die for their queen and kill Aizen. In the middle, Aizen's faction, weakened but still deadly, cornered and desperate. On the other side, the leadership of the Gote 13, a force of cataclysmic power, ready to enact their own brutal justice. And holding them all together, keeping them all alive, was Naruto. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp. The shield flickered violently. Another trickle of blood ran from his nose. Enough, he roared, his voice cracking with the strain, but imbued with an authority that silenced even Yamamoto. He turned his head, his brilliant blue eyes, now alight with a furious, incandescent power, sweeping over all of them. I don't care about your war, he yelled, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. It's over. Your grudges, your betrayals, your stupid, pointless fights, they're done. Look outside. That is the only enemy. That is the only thing that matters. He glared at Yamamoto. You want to burn them? Fine. You'll have to go through me. And my shield will drop, and we'll all be erased in 30 seconds. Is your justice worth the end of everything? He turned his glare on Harribel. You want to kill him. I get it, but his knowledge is the only thing that might give us a fighting chance. Is your revenge worth the lives of every person in this forest? He finally fixed his gaze on Aizen. And you started this. You are going to help us end it. No tricks, no schemes. You will give us everything. That is your penance. He stood before them all, not a god, not a king, but a desperate, powerful man laying down the simple, undeniable truth. His power was their shelter, and his word was now the only law. The sheer, unshakable force of his conviction, backed by the reality of the apocalypse just inches away, was more powerful than any Shikai or Resurrection. The silence that followed was broken by Yukitake, his voice calm and reasonable. He is right, Captain Commander. Our conflict with Aizen is secondary to the preservation of the worlds. We must understand this new threat. Shunsui tipped his hat. The kid's got a point. And a heck of a firewall. I'm not keen on finding out what happens if he turns it off. Yamamoto stood in grim silence, the flames around him slowly receding. His ancient eyes studied Naruto, analyzing the raw power, the absolute resolve. He saw not a hollow or a traitor, but a force of nature that had, for the moment, aligned with the principle of survival. He gave a single, curt nod. The Gote 13 would stand down. Aizen, seeing the balance of power shift entirely, let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. It was the sound of a master chess player realizing he was now a pawn in a much larger game. He gave a slight, mocking bow. It seems I am at your disposal, Naruto Uzumaki. My, what a strange and unpredictable world this has become. The immediate crisis was averted. The factions were not at each other's throats. But now they were something far more danger. Aus. A council of war made up of beings who had, just hours before, been trying to murder one another. They were a collection of devils, saints, predators, and scholars, all trapped in a golden cage. With the end of the world scratching at the door. Good, Naruto said, his voice dropping back to a strained grunt as he turned his full concentration back to the shield. Now, somebody tell me how we kill nothing. Chapter 8 End. Chapter 9. The Heart of the Abyss. The Great White Tree, the heart of Arbor de Vita, had become a war room. At its base, in a clearing of soft, glowing moss, the most unlikely and dangerous council in the history of the three worlds was gathered. A map, hastily drawn by Naruto in the dirt with a stick, showed the oasis and the roiling sea of nothingness that surrounded it. It was a laughably simple diagram for a cosmically complex problem. Sosuke Aizen stood over the map, using the tip of his sheathed Zanpakuto as a pointer. He had, to the disgust of everyone present, seamlessly transitioned from prisoner to lecturer. His fury had been superseded by a chilling, academic fascination with the apocalypse he had helped unleash. The entities you are calling the unmade are not truly creatures, he explained, his voice the calm, measured tone of a professor. They are extensions, mindless antibodies produced by a wounded dimension. Attacking them is like trying to cure a disease by swatting at the fever sweats. It is a pointless expenditure of energy. Captain Commander Yamamoto stood opposite him, his arms crossed, his spiritual pressure a contained inferno. Every word Aizen spoke was a grating insult to the order Yamamoto had upheld for 1,000 years, yet he listened. The old warrior understood the necessity of unpleasant intelligence. Get to the point, traitor. What is the source? The source is the rift itself, Aizen continued, gesturing upwards toward the silent, black wound in the sky. Or rather, what lies within it? The Kokyo. Based on the data I have gathered and the testimony of our host, he gave a slight, mocking nod toward Naruto. It is a sentient, core intelligence. A being of pure, conceptual non-existence. It is not some thing you can cut with a sword or burn with Kido. So we're to do nothing. Mila Rose snarled from the edge of the circle, where she stood guard with the other Fracken. We just wait in this glowing bubble until she jabbed a finger at Naruto, runs out of gas. On the contrary, Jin Ichimaru drawled, his smile having finally returned, though it was thinner, sharper. We're gonna do something real stupid. Aizen shot him an annoyed glance before continuing. You cannot destroy an absence. But you can, theoretically, fill it. The core intelligence is a void of purpose and being. It must be confronted with an equal and opposite force. Not of destruction, but of overwhelming existence. His gaze fell upon Naruto, and his eyes glinted with the manic light of a scientist about to witness the culmination of his life's work. His power is not Raryoku. It is life itself, drawn from another reality's wellspring. It is the perfect conceptual counter. And while he confronts this core, Yukitake asked, his brow furrowed with concern. The vanguard will not simply stand aside. Which is where the rest of us come in, Aizen said, a genuine, almost gleeful smile touching his lips. We will provide the most glorious distraction in history. The captain commander, myself, the other captains, the Espada, we will combine our power to create a temporary path through the horde. A corridor of force through which a strike team can pass. He looked around the circle. Our role is not to win. It is simply to hold the door open. A battle of attrition against an infinite enemy. The plan was insane. A suicide mission built on a theoretical gamble. A strike team of 2, Aizen concluded, his gaze settling on Harribel. Naruto Uzumaki is the weapon. But his power is raw, a force of nature. It needs a focus, a purpose. Your power, Tercera, has always been defined by your will to protect, to sacrifice for a cause. You are the vessel that can give his power direction. It was a brilliant, manipulative stroke. He was appealing to her core nature, framing her as the essential component, not just a subordinate. He was ensuring that the two beings whose bond he understood the least would be thrown into the heart of the abyss, where he could observe the outcome. Harribel looked at Naruto. He was still holding the shield, but he had shifted into a meditative pose, conserving every ounce of energy. The blood had dried on his upper lip. He looked tired, vulnerable, yet the golden light of the barrier remained unbroken. She saw the truth in Aizen's logic, however much she hated the source. This was their fight. Before the council could dissolve into arguments, she walked away from them, toward Naruto. She stopped before him, just outside the reach of his focused energy. She knelt, so they were at eye level. He is right, she said, her voice soft, for his ears only. About the part where we fly into the giant hole of death and probably don't come back?" he asked, a ghost of a smile on his lips. His eyes, however, were deadly serious. "About us being the only ones who can." She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before she gently brushed the dried blood from his face. Her touch was feather-light. "The memory you showed the guardian in the forest, I felt it. The loneliness. No child should have to endure that." His smile faded, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "No one should. You came here," she continued, her voice a near whisper, "and you ended my loneliness. You gave my people a home. You gave me hope." She met his gaze, her own teal eyes, which had held nothing but cold pragmatism for so long, were now filled with a fierce, unwavering light. "I will not let you face the abyss alone. Your impossible ideal, protecting everyone, I believe in it now. I will be your shield." Naruto Uzumaki. It was a declaration, an oath. It was everything she could not say, spoken in the language of a warrior queen. He reached up and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. His skin was warm, radiating a gentle energy. "Just promise me one thing, Shark Queen. Anything. When we get back," he said, his blue eyes boring into hers, "we build together. A real kingdom. A real home. For everyone." It was not a proposal for a treaty. It was a proposal for a future. A future beyond the war, beyond the fighting, beyond the survival. She gave his hand a firm squeeze, a silent, binding contract. Together. That was all they needed. The final battle had its stakes. The assault began with a silent, coordinated breath. The heavy hitters, Yamamoto, Aizen, Shunsui, Yukitaki, Jin, and Tosen, took their positions behind Naruto. Harribel stood at his side, her fraction a pace behind her, their faces grim masks of determination. "Ready?" Naruto asked her, not taking his eyes off the roiling blackness outside. "I was born ready," she replied, drawing her Zanpakuto. With a deafening roar of will, Naruto pulled. He did not drop the shield. He gathered a 20-meter-wide section of it, pulling the golden energy back into himself like a lungful of air, creating a temporary, gaping hole in the dome. The moment the way was clear, the assault force exploded into action. Ryujin Jaka. Yamamoto's voice was the sound of a sun being born. A wave of fire so intense it bleached the color from the world erupted from his blade, a tidal wave of annihilation that crashed into the vanguard of the unmade. The creatures of nothingness did not burn. The flames, the very concept of heat and energy, were simply eaten by the void. But the sheer, overwhelming force of the attack created a momentary pocket of space. Hado number 90. Kurohitsugi. Aizen's incantation was a cold, precise whisper. A colossal coffin of black spiritual energy erupted in the center of the unmade horde. Its immense gravitational force pulling the creatures inward, not to crush them, but to contain them, to hold them in a prison of ordered reality. Shunsui and Yukitaki moved like a well-oiled machine, their twin Zanpakutos creating a crossfire of wind and lightning that sliced and hurted the unmade, pushing them away from the forming corridor. It was a battle of pure, conceptual attrition. Fire against void, order against chaos. It was the desperate, frantic effort of reality itself trying to hold back the tide of its own negation. "Now!" Naruto yelled. He grabbed Harribel's hand. Golden chakra exploded around him, forming the massive, spectral form of Kurama, the nine-tailed fox. He and Harribel stood within its ethereal ribcage as if on the bridge of a great warship. With a roar that was a mixture of a man's yell and a demon's howl, the chakra avatar launched itself forward, through the breach in the shield and into the corridor being held open by their desperate, powerful allies. They flew through a tunnel of fire and black magic, flanked on all sides by silent, writhing horrors. They saw Aizen, his face a mask of ecstatic concentration as he warped reality around them. They saw Yamamoto, a pillar of white-hot flame, holding back 1,000 grasping, empty hands. It was a vision of hell, presided over by devils and gods fighting on the same side. Then they were through. They shot past the horde and angled upward, directly toward the silent, black rift in the sky. Entering the rift was like being plunged into ice water and a sensory deprivation tank at the same time. All sound, all light, all sensation vanished. They were in a place that was not a place, an absolute, infinite blackness. The Kurama avatar provided the only light, a defiant, golden sun in the heart of oblivion. In the center of the void, they found it. The core intelligence. It was not a creature. It was a perfect, flawless sphere of absolute black, 10 times the size of the Kurama avatar. It was a hole in the universe. A singularity of nothingness that radiated a silence so profound it was a deafening roar in the mind. As they approached, it spoke, its voice not a sound, but a direct, cold injection of thought into their souls. You exist. This is a flaw. Pain is the only truth of existence. Oblivion is the only mercy. Let me show you. The world dissolved. Naruto was no longer in the Kurama avatar. He was a child again, shivering in a cold, dark alley in Konoha. He could hear the whispers of the villagers, sharp and full of hate. Demon. Monster. Stay away from him. He saw the faces of his friends, Sasuke, Sakura, Kakashi, turning away from him in disgust. He felt the crushing, unbearable weight of a loneliness so complete it was a physical agony. This is your truth, the Kokyo whispered in his mind. A life of pain, chasing a recognition that will never come. Why endure it? Surrender. Be unmade. Find peace in the silence. He felt his resolve crumbling, the gold chakra of the avatar flickering as his own despair threatened to consume him. Harribel was thrown into her own hell. She stood on a mountain of corpses, and every single one wore the face of one of her fracken, of one of her soldiers. Of every person she had ever tried to protect. Their dead eyes stared up at her, their silent mouths accusing her. Your every action leads to their deaths, the void hissed in her soul. You are a queen of sacrifice, but your sacrifices are meaningless. You only lead them to their doom. To protect them is to fail them. Let me give them the peace you never could. Let me erase their suffering. Let me erase you. She fell to her knees, the weight of 1,000 failures breaking her spirit. Her Zanpakuto clattered to the ground. They were both about to be consumed, their own hearts their executioners. But then, in the deepest part of the shared darkness, a single image sparked. The memory of her, sitting beside him at the lake, her hand in his. A promise of a future. In her despair, a vision. Him, standing before Aizen, his power a shield for her family. His tired smile as he created a forest from dust. His impossible, infuriating hope. They found each other. Naruto looked up from his alleyway and saw not the hateful villagers, but Harribel, standing on her mountain of corpses, about to break. He saw her strength, her loyalty, the fierce love that she hid behind a mask of ice. He remembered why he was fighting. Not for recognition. For her. For them. Harribel looked up from her dead and saw not their accusing eyes, but Naruto, a lonely, crying child. She saw the pain that had forged him, the empathy born from suffering. She saw the man who had looked at her dead world and had not seen a wasteland, but a garden waiting to be born. You are not alone. The thought was not the Kokyo's. It was theirs, a silent scream to each other across the abyss of their own minds. The darkness shattered. They were back in the Kurama avatar, the black sphere of the Kokyo pulsing before them. They were battered, their souls bruised, but they were not broken. They were together, and their bond, forged in conflict and tempered in shared vulnerability, was now their unbreakable armor. You're wrong, Naruto said, his voice echoing with the power of the 9 tails. Pain isn't the only truth. The connections we make, the bonds we forge, that's the truth. He rose to his full height within the avatar, his hands coming together. Golden chakra, mixed with the pure, white energy of the Sage of 6 Paths, began to spin and coalesce between his palms. It was a Rasengan, but it was also a Bijudama. It was destruction and creation, infused with the one thing the Kokyo could not comprehend, life itself. A miniature, swirling star of pure existence. Harribel stood beside him, her resolve a pillar of steel. She held her Zanpakuto aloft, and her own spiritual pressure surged. I am not a queen of meaningless sacrifice, she declared, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. I am the shield that protects my own. She poured her entire being, her will, her purpose, into her blade. Her power was not just an attack, it was an ideal. The ideal of protection made manifest. Let's go, Naruto roared. Together, he thrust his hands forward, unleashing the tailed beast bomb Rasenshuriken. Harribel swung her blade, releasing her own power not as a separate attack, but as a guiding wave. A current of pure purpose that wrapped around Naruto's sphere of life. The two attacks merged. It was not a simple combination of energy. It was a fusion of philosophies. His boundless, chaotic life force, and her focused, unwavering will to protect. It was an attack of pure, weaponized hope. The swirling star of life and purpose shot across the void and struck the heart of the Kokyo. There was no explosion. There was no sound. There was only light. A silent, impossible, all-consuming white light that filled the void, filled their vision, and filled the universe. It was the light of a new beginning, a conceptual Big Bang aimed at the heart of the great, empty nothing. Chapter 9 End. Chapter 10. Dawn over the white sands. The white light was not a flash. It was an eternity, a single, silent, perfect moment where the concept of nothing was overwhelmed by the concept of everything. There was no heat, no force, only a profound and absolute sense of peace. The feeling of a discordant note being resolved into a perfect chord. Then, as slowly and gently as it had arrived, it receded, leaving behind a stillness that was not empty, but calm. Naruto and Harribel floated in the void that was no longer a void. The great, black sphere of the Kokyo was gone. In its place was a new star, a shimmering, incandescent sphere of pure, golden white life energy, the lingering echo of their combined will. It pulsed with a gentle, steady rhythm, a newborn heart in the chest of the abyss. Their attack hadn't destroyed the nothingness, it had filled it. They had turned a wound in the universe into a font of creation. The effort, however, had cost them nearly everything. The Kurama avatar had dissolved, its last embers of chakra poured into the final attack. They were just themselves now. Two small figures in an endless, quiet space. Naruto's own energy reserves were scraped dry, the deep well of the Ten Tails' power reduced to a mere puddle. He felt a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical, a weariness of the soul. Beside him, Harribel was pale, her spiritual pressure a flickering candle flame. She had poured her very essence, the core of her identity as a protector. Into that final strike, she felt hollowed out, yet strangely serene. Did we? She began, her voice a hoarse whisper. We did, Naruto confirmed, his own voice ragged. He looked around. The rift, the tear in the sky, was still there, but the malevolent pressure was gone. The door was open, but the beast was slain. But it's not over. That light, it's a patch. It won't hold forever. We need to close the door. He looked at her, and she saw in his exhausted eyes the same unyielding resolve that had carried them this far. There was one last task. They moved toward the edges of the rift. Their movements slow and sluggish. They were running on fumes, their immense power reduced to a final, desperate act of will. They reached the fraying edge of their reality, the place where the world had been torn apart. Like sewing a wound, Naruto murmured, more to himself than to her. He raised his hands, which trembled with the effort. From his palms, threads of golden energy emerged, faint and thin but infused with the absolute power of creation of all things. He was not just pushing the edges together, he was coaxing new reality into existence, weaving the torn fabric shut. Harribel understood. She raised her own hands, and from them flowed not a torrent of water, but a fine, shimmering mist of pure reishi, the very building blocks of their world. She used her say control to guide Naruto's threads of creation, acting as the needle while he provided the golden thread. It was a slow, agonizing process. With every thread they wove, they could feel the last of their strength draining away. The world outside the rift began to come back into focus, a blurry image of the desert battlefield below. They could see the faint flashes of Kido and Sero, the desperate last stand of their allies against the last of the unmade, who were now leaderless and dissolving, but still dangerous. They sealed the final inch of the tier. The moment the two sides met, a tremor ran through the fabric of space. The sky of Hueco Mundo stitched itself shut, the angry black line vanishing as if it had never been. The silence of the void was replaced by the roar of the wind. Their purpose fulfilled, their strength utterly spent, they began to fall. The descent was a dizzying, weightless tumble. Exhaustion finally claimed them, their consciousness fading. The last thing Naruto saw was the ground rushing up to meet them. The last thing Harribel felt was his hand, still loosely clasped in hers. They did not hit the ground. A net, woven from the intricate pink energy of Shunsui Kyoraku's Kido, materialized beneath them, cradling them gently. At the same time, 3 serpentine streams of energy, Sun's signature technique, wrapped around them, guiding their descent to a soft landing in the center of the ravaged battlefield. They collapsed onto the sand, unconscious but alive, their hands still linked. A moment of stunned silence fell over the disparate armies. The last of the unmade. Their connection to the Kokyo severed, dissolved into harmless motes of black dust. The oppressive darkness that had blanketed the world was gone. The golden dome of Naruto's shield, its purpose served, faded away like a dream. And then, for the first time in its recorded history, a true, natural dawn broke over Haweko Mundo. From the eastern horizon, a line of brilliant orange and soft pink light appeared, chasing away the perpetual twilight. A real sun, a distant star in a real sky, began to rise, bathing the white sands and the faces of the stunned warriors in a warm, gentle light. The air, once sterile and sharp, now tasted clean and fresh. The very atmosphere of the world had been reborn. The survivors, Shinigami, Arankar, and Traitor, stood in the light of the new day, looking not at each other, but at the 2 figures lying unconscious in the sand. They had gone into the heart of the abyss and had returned with the dawn. Yamamoto was the first to move. His face, ancient and etched with the scars of 1,000 battles, was a mask of grim, weary respect. He walked toward the fallen form of Sosuke Aizen, who stood alone, his Hogyoku-fused body battered but healing. His expression one of utter disbelief. He was staring at the sunrise, and for the first time, he looked not like a god, but like a man who had just witnessed a miracle he could not comprehend. The Captain Commander's hand went to the hilt of Ryujin Jaka. The heat began to rise. The threat is ended, he rasped, his voice like grinding stone. Now, justice will be done. Wait. The voice was weak, but it cut through the tension with an undeniable authority. Naruto was stirring, pushing himself up onto one elbow, his body protesting every movement. Harribel was beside him, also waking, her fracken rushing to her side. Naruto staggered to his feet, using Harribel's shoulder for support. He faced the Captain Commander, his body weak but his will as strong as ever. No more killing, he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. His war is over, his ambition is broken. Killing him now is not justice. It's just tying up a loose end. He met Aizen's shocked gaze. The man who had schemed to sit on the throne of heaven now looked at him with a complex mixture of hatred, awe, and grudging respect. You wanted to be a god, Aizen, Naruto said, his voice soft but carrying across the silent battlefield. You wanted to be above everyone, to decide their fates. Your punishment won't be death. It will be to live among them. He pushed himself away from Harribel and took a shaky step forward. He raised a hand, and the last vestiges of his 6 paths sage mode flared to life. It was not an attack. He placed his palm on Aizen's chest, directly over the Hogyoku. I can't destroy it, Naruto said. But I can sever your connection. I can lock the door. A seal, far more complex and powerful than any Kido, spread from his palm across Aizen's body. It was a latticework of golden Iden black kanji that sank into his very soul. Aizen cried out, a sound of pure agony, as he felt his connection to the Hogyoku, the source of his evolution and power, being violently and permanently ripped away. His transcendent form flickered and dissolved, his power level plummeting until he was left as he was before, a Shinigami of immense, but now finite, power. A mortal, you wanted to be a god, Naruto repeated, his voice filled with a profound pity. Now you get to learn what it means to be a man. He stumbled back, caught by a grateful and astonished Yukitake. Aizen collapsed to his knees, not from injury, but from the sheer, crushing weight of his own failure. It was a fate worse than any incineration. Yamamoto lowered his blade. He looked at Naruto, then at Harribel, who now stood tall, her fracken a protective wall around her. He looked at the assembled Arankar, no longer a mindless horde, but the army of a new kingdom. He looked at the rising sun. The world had changed. The old rules no longer applied. The Gote 13 recognizes this domain, Yamamoto declared, his voice a formal proclamation. Haweko Mundo is now a sovereign nation, under the protection of its appointed leaders. The long war between Shinigami and Hollow is over. A truce is declared, effective immediately. It was a political masterstroke, an acknowledgement of the new reality. Shunsui Kyoraku smiled, a genuine, relieved smile for the first time. The long, bloody cycle was finally broken. Some time later, after the Shinigami had departed with their now powerless prisoner, after the battlefield had been cleared, and after a weary, fragile peace had settled over the land, Harribel and Naruto stood on the highest balcony of Las Noches. The fortress, once a monument to Aizen's cold, empty ambition, was being transformed. Banners bearing Harribel's shark symbol now hung from its walls. From the great central tower, a spring of pure, life-giving water, a gift from Naruto, now flowed, creating a river that snaked its way across the desert toward the distant green jewel of Arbor de Vida. The Urankar, a unified people for the first time, worked below, their purpose no longer conquest but construction. The sun, a real and permanent fixture in their sky, was beginning to set, painting the white sands in brilliant hues of crimson and gold. Naruto leaned against the railing, the exhaustio end of the battle having given way to a deep, profound peace. The ancient loneliness that had haunted him for centuries was gone, replaced by the quiet, steady presence of the woman beside him. She came to stand next to him, following his gaze out over their new world. She was no longer just the warrior, the Tercera Espada. She was a true queen, her presence radiating a calm, confident authority. "It's beautiful," she said. The words simple, yet holding the weight of a lifetime of darkness now banished. He turned to her, a soft, genuine smile on his face. "We have a lot of work to do. A whole world to build." He recalled his promise, the one made in the shadow of the abyss. About that kingdom, she looked at him, and the smile that had so rarely touched her lips now bloomed, reaching her eyes and filling them with a light that rivaled the sunset. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. The connection was no longer a desperate grasp in the darkness, but a firm, steady anchor in the light of a new day. "We build," she said, her voice filled with a hope she once would have called a weakness, but now knew to be the greatest strength of all. Together, they stood in comfortable silence, hand in hand, the king of life and the queen of the sands, watching the first sunset in the history of their world, their lonely reigns finally over, and their shared future just beginning. Chapter 10 End.